Hey guys, tonight we time travel through barbed wire, telegrams, and the muddy whispers of World War I. You're walking down a cobbled street in Sarajevo. The air is thick with cigarette smoke, roasted chestnuts, and the low rumble of imperial politics. Your shoes click against stone just moments before history punches the world in the face. You probably won't survive this, statistically speaking. Trench foot alone might get you before the bullets do, and we haven't even started the war yet. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, let me know your location and local time down in the comments. I read every single one, even the cryptic ones from 3 AM philosophers. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You hear a carriage wheel squeak, horses shuffle their hooves, and a small motor car glides awkwardly down the boulevard. Archduke Franz Ferdinand sits stiffly in the back seat. His mustache is aggressively symmetrical. His wife Sophie, elegant as always, offers a quiet smile to the gathering crowd. You don't notice Gavrilo Princip yet. He's a weary young man, 19 years old, standing in the shadows near a delicatessen. He's part of a ragtag group of idealists and would-be assassins. Their plot is messy, half-baked with cyanide pills that don't work in bombs that go off at the wrong time. But it doesn't matter, because somehow it still works. The gunshot that changes the world sounds small, like a firecracker swallowed by street noise, but you feel it. A jolt through the air, like static right before a thunderstorm. And just like that, you're in a reality suspended above chaos. The crowd screams, scatters, collides. Sophie collapses first. Franz groans, holding his neck. 2 lives gone, 17 million others to follow. And you blink slowly, realizing you're standing at the fault line of modern history. Scientists still argue whether the war was truly inevitable, or if just a few changed decisions, maybe a misturn or a jammed pistol, could have held back the tidal wave. But nations were hungry for pride, for colonies, for a fight to define themselves. All they needed was an excuse. The Austro-Hungarian Empire blames Serbia. Demands pile up like mismatched socks. Serbia flinches. Russia steps in. Germany postures. France flexes. Britain checks its calendar, sips tea, and starts reviewing its treaties. Like a domino chain constructed by over-caffeinated schoolboys, the entire continent lurches toward war. But hey, remember, it's 1914. Nobody's texting. Nobody's tweeting threats. Declarations of war are handwritten, sealed with wax, and delivered by mustached men on bicycles. It's all very polite, until it's not. You shift uneasily on your feet as military trains screech into motion. Wooden wheels, iron sparks, steam hissing like an angry kettle. Europe's railways become veins of fury, pumping soldiers to front lines that don't even exist yet. The romanticism dies early, somewhere between a stiff wool uniform and a pair of leaking boots. Here's a weird fact. Many soldiers thought they'd be home by Christmas. Over by Christmas became a catchphrase so widely accepted that people canceled long-term plans. It's the war equivalent of saying, "This'll just take 5 minutes." Spoiler alert, it did not take 5 minutes. A mainstream scientific fact that slides into this. Kinetic energy. When you fire a standard issue rifle, the bullet exits the muzzle at over 700 meters per second. That's enough force to punch through helmets, bones, and hope. Add artillery shells with blast radii the size of suburban lawns, and you've got yourself a cocktail of destruction the world has never quite metabolized. Now, while you soak all this in, a fun but under-discussed tidbit, Archduke Franz Ferdinand's license plate number was II-118, as in, Armistice, November the 11th, 1918, the date the war ended. Creepy coincidence, or just the universe getting cheeky. Either way, you watch from a cafe bench as headlines explode. Newspapers flap open like startled birds. Austria declares war. Germany mobilizes. Britain joins conflict. And tucked between the lines, barely noticed, the lives of ordinary people unravel. You think of farmers trading plows for rifles, of school teachers turned map readers, of bakers forced to ration flour. You smell oil, coal smoke, and rising dread. And as you wander past a crowd gathered around a crackling radio, the kind with big knobs and deep wood grain, You hear the crackle of the future humming into focus. Not everyone's thrilled, of course. In the UK, a man named Bertrand Russell protests war publicly, risking arrest. Patriotism, he says, is the willingness to kill and be killed for trivial reasons. Scientists and scholars gather in dusty rooms, debating ethics, technology, and whether humanity's rational mind can survive its tribal heart. And still the trains roll. They bring men in from farms, factories, and families. Boots on ballast, rifles in hand, uncertainty tucked under every collar. You hop onto a crowded platform, pressed between sweating bodies and stiff collars. Some men whistle, some joke, one shivers despite the heat. All are headed for something far bigger than they've been told. You exult, breath catching on coal dust and irony. Here's the scientific kicker for tonight's section: emotional contagion. Studies show emotions, like yawns or laughter, can spread through groups via facial expressions and body language. So when fear takes hold in a train car, or excitement surges across a battalion, it ripples outward like a dropped stone in still water. In this war, emotional contagion fuels both bravery and mass panic. You clutch the rail as the train lurches forward. The sky is too blue. The clouds look too innocent. Somewhere, a general sharpens pencils and starts sketching the first real trenches. The wheels grind on. Somewhere down the line, you'll smell chlorine gas and taste iron in your teeth. But not yet. Not tonight. The train screeches to a halt, like metal screaming as it's torn apart. You step off onto the platform, somewhere in the rural haze of France, or maybe Belgium. Hard to say. Smoke drifts like lazy ghosts, just waiting to whisper your name. The ground is smeared with wet mud, and the heavy breath of boys who became soldiers overnight. You've never heard silence this heavy. Every footstep lands like a punch to the air. The wind slips over the fields but no longer sings, just mutters. In the distance, artillery rumbles, not like in the movies. There's no boom. It's a deep growl, like the earth itself is twisting from pain. They send you to the front line. A trench, narrow, soaked, and smelling like the bathroom of a broken world. To your left is a kid no older than 17, clutching an unsent letter. To your right, a man whose eyes seem to have seen every lifetime at once. You lean against the mud wall. An officer hands you a Lee Enfield rifle. It's cold, heavy, and far too real. You start to ask, when do we? But he just points forward, toward the fog so thick it could hide a crumbling universe. They call it no man's land, but it's full of things that used to be people. Shattered skulls, torn limbs, helmets buried with bones. You see the debris of patriotism ground into the gears of nationalism. And then it hits you. This isn't a parade. War is a lesson written in blood and read in silence. When the order comes, no one yells, charge, like in the films. Just a whistle, dry, hollow, the kind of sound that could wake you from a death dream. You climb the trench ladder, over the muddy rim, and run. Bullets hiss past your ears. One guy drops, then another. You don't stop, not because you're brave, but because if you stop, you're dead. And deep in your mind, a quiet voice whispers, I shouldn't be here. You dive behind a warped sheet of metal, gasping. Your heart bangs like a Victorian sewing machine. A bullet tears through the top of your helmet. Too close. Somewhere, someone's screaming for help, but you can't tell where. It's like the sky itself is shouting from every direction at once. And then the shell. It lands 10 meters away. You're flung backward. No sound now, just a ringing, like you've fallen underwater. Dust in your eyes. Your head slams against something hard. When you blink, the world tilts sideways. Your fingers trace your face. Blood, but still breathing. Not yet. A hand yanks you up. Another soldier. A stranger. No name. But his eyes say, we don't leave each other behind. You crawl back into the trench like an animal scurrying into its den. There, you lie. No words, no thoughts, just breath and heartbeat. The only proof you're still human. Science calls this state combat shock, later known as PTSD. When overwhelmed, your brain shuts down emotional processing just to keep you alive. But trauma doesn't heal. It just waits. The next day, an officer gives a speech about strategic value, about maintaining morale. You look at him like he's a ghost in uniform. Words like strategy, sacrifice, glory, they don't mean anything anymore. Just trash floating on the surface of a flooded graveyard. You stop counting days. You only count how many times you didn't die. Then one day, you're pulled from the front, sent back for a week's rest, bath, hot meal, a newspaper. But you can't sleep. The shelling still thuds inside your skull like a metronome from hell. A cat darts across the road and your heart slams against your ribs like a sniper just took aim. A horse cart rattles and you duck instinctively. People ask, is it like they say? You smile tight, nod. But inside, you're screaming. They don't know anything. You start writing. Letters you never send. Journal entries you bury under dirt. You sketch faces you don't want to forget. The ones left behind. You don't believe in slogans anymore, but you believe in survival, in tiny kindnesses amid the madness. Like when a German soldier sang, "Silent Night," on Christmas Eve and the shooting paused. That's when you realized, the enemy is human too. One day in the woods, you find a tiny notebook, torn and damp. Last page says, handwritten, "If I don't come back, let the world know I once dreamed." You keep it, like a relic, a voice recording of the soul of humanity, trapped inside a machine gone mad. And then, November the 11th, 1918, the whistle blows, the guns stop. You don't cheer, you don't dance, you just sit, eyes on the sky, hands in the dirt, and your eyes begin to cry. Peace, but ragged peace, like a coat torn after a hurricane. They say the war is over, but inside you, it still echoes, like a song no one asked for. You go home, but no one's waiting. Your town is different, you are different. You walk past mirrors and don't recognize the man. And when you sleep, you still hear the whistle. The war ends, but the wounds remain, and the world still hasn't learned. You step off the train again, this time, in a world that calls itself post-war, but your boots still remember the mud. Your ears still twitch at distant thunder, even if it's just a summer storm, or a cartwheel on cobblestone. You walk past shops with patriotic bunting, but the air smells like something's rotting under the floorboards of peace. It's 1919. And the war is officially over. But in reality, it's just moved into the parlors, offices, and treaty halls. The old world is gasping for reinvention. You're in Paris now, wearing a jacket that doesn't quite fit, and a face that looks 20 years older than your age. Everyone's talking about the Treaty of Versailles, the so-called document to end all conflict. World leaders gather in glittering halls, shaking hands, puffing cigars, and carving up borders like meat at a butcher's table. You sit in a cafe near the Hotel de Crillon, watching the procession of diplomats and delegates. Their shoes are polished, their bellies full, their nerves untouched. A waiter drops a tray and flinches. So do you. Across the table, someone laughs about reparations. You wonder if they've ever seen a man bleed out through a sock. The treaty gets signed. Woodrow Wilson pushes his 14 points like a guy trying to sell hope door to door. But France wants vengeance. Britain wants balance. Germany gets blamed for everything. Scientists still argue whether this document was the blueprint for peace, or the fuse to the next explosion. You overhear a British officer mutter, "That'll show the Huns." He toasts the punishment clause, Article 231, the war guilt clause. The moment Germany is officially declared the villain, you sip your espresso and think, no one wins a war, some just lose slower. You wander the city, aimless. Your uniform's been folded into a trunk somewhere, but you still feel its weight. A woman bumps into you, apologizes. You nod, then realize you haven't spoken all day. The silence is becoming your native language. That night, you pass through the Place de la Concorde. The statues stare at you like witnesses. There's something about standing where kings were beheaded, then watching bureaucrats pretend they're gods. You lie in bed in your tiny, rented room, listening to the buzz of electricity in the wall, thinking it sounds a little like incoming fire. Science tells us the human brain rewires itself after trauma. The hippocampus shrinks. The amygdala goes haywire. That means memory gets fragmented. Emotions get dialed up or down unpredictably. You aren't just feeling weird. Your brain is rebuilding itself after catastrophe. You visit the medical ward out of curiosity. Soldiers with missing limbs joke about becoming pirates. One guy has glass eyes that don't quite match. Another has tremors so bad he can't hold a spoon. The nurse calls it shell shock. Some folks think it's cowardice. Others call it divine punishment. But deep down, you know it's just the cost of survival. You remember the man in your unit, who used to sing opera at dusk. He didn't make it, but now, in the quiet moments, his voice still echoes. Your mind has become a museum of ghosts, and no one buys tickets. In a narrow alley, you see a group of children playing war. Wooden guns. Bang bang. You're dead. They laugh and fall over. You want to shout, "Don't play with this fire." But what would be the point? They'll learn in their own time, or they won't. Some nights, you visit a library and thumb through newspapers. Everyone's theorizing. Books titled Why the War Happened, The Future of Europe, The Decline of Empires. You pick one up and read a passage about how alliances turned a regional conflict into a global inferno, like stacking dynamite, then acting surprised when someone lights a match. And just when you think peace might settle in, revolutions begin brewing. Russia is already lost to Bolsheviks. Italy's storming with black shirts. Germany simmers with resentment and strange new ideologies. The ink on the treaty isn't even dry before the next storm begins to gather. You read about hyperinflation in Berlin, how people carry wages in wheelbarrows and burn currency for warmth. And you wonder, how long until anger becomes a banner again? Meanwhile, back in France, a veteran is building a strange new invention, a prosthetic hand made from bicycle parts. It looks clunky, but it works. Fringe idea, some say, but necessity makes engineers of us all. A doctor tells you about a new method, talk therapy for war trauma. Not everyone believes in it yet. Some say the mind can't be mended like a bone. Others whisper, give it time. Scientists still argue whether these therapies help or just allow veterans to repackage the pain. You meet a nurse who says she's writing poetry. She reads you one about mud, and poppies, and memory. You don't cry, but your throat tightens like it's remembering something your conscious brain can't quite place. That's the thing about trauma. It isn't linear. It ambushes you like fog. Soft, quiet, consuming. By the time you leave Paris, the glamour has worn off. The treaty is just paper now. The real battle, the one inside people, is only beginning. And as you climb aboard the train heading west, you think, war doesn't end when the shooting stops. It ends when the silence doesn't hurt anymore. Which, for most people, takes longer than history books admit. The train lurches forward with a heavy sigh, like it knows the weight of what it's carrying. You lean against the window, watching France dissolve into a blur of fields and farmhouses. Each one probably lost a son, or a brother, or a reason to trust the future. You feel like you're traveling through a graveyard that's pretending to be a country. Your boots thud onto the wooden planks of a small Belgian station. The air smells of wet stone and roasted chicory. People nod politely, but their eyes still look out for uniforms, or for the absence of them. This is where neutrality once lived. Remember Belgium, the country everyone swore to protect. Yeah, that turned out great. You're here because someone mentioned the word Reconstruction. That magical term governments love to throw around when they mean, good luck fixing it yourselves. You walk through towns where bricks are stacked like Lego dreams. Half-rebuilt cathedrals stand beside craters, and families sell beetroot stew on corners just to make rent. War doesn't end. It just changes outfits. And while you're watching an old man repair a roof with metal scavenged from shell casings, the school teacher tells you something that sticks. We still hear the guns at night. Not metaphorically, literally. Apparently, out near Ypres, unexploded munitions still detonate now and then when the ground shifts, or some poor cow steps wrong. Scientists say soil memory, yes, that's a thing, can hold pressure changes for decades. The land itself is traumatized. You walk through what was once no man's land. Now it's farmland again, or trying to be. Turnips grow where trenches once crawled with rats. A farmer warns you not to step too far. The iron harvest, he calls it. Each spring, thousands of leftover shells and bullets rise to the surface like bad memories. He stacks them by the fence like firewood. One explodes just a mile away. It rattles your teeth. You blink. The farmer doesn't even flinch. Still dangerous, he shrugs. But the cabbage has to come up. You spend the night in a village inn, sharing a room with a window that rattles in the wind. The owner serves you black bread and cheese. Her husband lost both legs at the Marne, and now carves spoons with his teeth. Keeps him from thinking, she says, then smiles like it's a joke. You don't laugh. The next morning, you walk past a schoolyard where children recite the alphabet and sing. It's jarring. Their laughter sounds like someone tuning a broken radio, static, joyful, haunting. You realize they're the first generation born after the war, and already, their textbooks are full of victory songs. You sit on a bench, write a letter you never sent. You describe the mud, the noise, the way the ground shook even when it didn't. You draw a little map of where your best friend died, then fold it up and tuck it into your coat pocket like a secret. Science fact for the day. The average human ear can detect vibrations as small as 20 micropascals, basically the quietest sound we can hear. But during trench bombardments, sound levels reached over 160 decibels. That's louder than a jet engine. Your hearing never fully recovered. Sometimes, when it's too quiet, you still hear the whine of an incoming shell. It's phantom sound. The brain, like a loyal but slightly drunk dog, keeps trying to protect you even when the danger's gone. You visit an old church, now converted into a recovery home. Not for bodies, for minds. They call it the House of Rest. The walls are painted soft blue, the kind that's supposed to calm anxiety. Patients tend to gardens, feed rabbits, paint watercolors of places they'll probably never visit again. A man named Lucien shows you his masterpiece, a meadow with no trenches. He says it's where he hides in his dreams. Scientists still argue whether art therapy actually rewires neural pathways, or just gives the illusion of healing. But standing next to Lucien and his brushstroke piece, you're not sure it matters. Illusions can be oxygen. At dinner, someone makes a joke about Kaiser Wilhelm's mustache, and half the room chuckles like it's 1914 again. For a moment, the war slips off everyone's shoulders. Not gone, just shifted to a different coat hook. Later, you pass a train yard full of rusting tanks. Some still wear camouflage paint like they're pretending to blend in. Kids climb them, playing King of the Hill. You wonder if they realize those machines once breathed fire, or maybe they do, and that's the fun. You meet a man who collects war relics. Not medals, not letters, actual shrapnel, helmets, boots. He shows you a mess tin with a bullet hole in it. The guy survived, he says. Carried this for luck until the next war got him. You blink. Next war. He grins without joy. Oh, it's coming. You can feel it in the air. And yeah, you can. At night, you lie awake in a creaky cot, staring at the ceiling where candlelight flickers like old gunfire. You try to sleep, but the bed's too soft. Isn't that strange? You spent years dreaming of comfort, and now your muscles miss the cold dirt. It's like your body forgot how to trust rest. Quirky tidbit. Some veterans sleep with boots on for years after they come home. Not because they expect battle, just because bare feet feel too vulnerable. There's even a name for it. Combat conditioning. It's not trauma, it's muscle memory. As you finally drift off, the wind howls through the shutter like a distant whistle. For a second, your heart skips. Then you remember where you are. You're safe. Kind of. You wake to the smell of boiled chicory again. It's bitter and earthy, like the world is trying to apologize through your nose. The innkeeper hands you a small thermos. Keeps the chill off, she says, and you pretend it helps. But the cold isn't in your bones. It's in your memories. Outside, fog clings low to the fields like it's afraid to let go. You walk past a row of wooden crosses, unmarked, weather-beaten. Their names forgotten, but their presence undeniable. One is cracked right down the middle, and a bird has nested in the split. Nature moves on. You're not sure if that's beautiful or just deeply offensive. You keep heading west toward the coast. The roads improve, slightly. Every few miles there's a fresh monument, a plaque, a statue of some tired soldier staring into eternity. Most are chipped. A few have bullet marks, not from the war, but from bored locals decades later. Turns out peace can be just as trigger-happy. You reach a coastal village, where the wind always smells of salt and seaweed. The beach is quiet, and children build sandcastles with the same care their grandparents used to dig trenches. There's a rusted tank half buried in the dunes, now part of the landscape like an ugly sculpture that no one wants to move. You meet a fisherman who served at Gallipoli. He's missing 3 fingers and part of his left ear. The sea's quieter, he says, hauling in a net full of herring. You ask why he came back to fishing. He shrugs. Shells or storms, it's all chaos. At least here, I can eat what tries to kill me. Scientists still argue whether the trauma of combat is best healed by silence or storytelling. The fisherman tells you both work fine, if you know when to use each. Then he offers you a herring, which is the most honest therapy session you've had in weeks. You sit on the dock, nibbling smoked fish while watching gulls argue in the sky. One of them dive bombs a crab and misses spectacularly. You chuckle, and for once it doesn't feel stolen. Just earn. There's a small museum nearby, one of those local passion projects, where everything's labeled in fading pen ink, and half the artifacts are probably authentic. You wander past trench maps, bayonets, and a surprisingly intact pair of underpants labeled 1915. Definitely. Quirky. Yes. A little cursed. Also yes. One display catches your eye. Letters home. The handwriting is neat, shaky, full of hope. One line stands out. Tell little Mary, the first still carry her drawing in my helmet. You blink hard and move on. Later, you follow a footpath up a windswept cliff, where a weather station now stands. The man inside tracks barometric pressure and reads cloud formations like fortunes. He says the wind up here never lies. According to him, there's a 72% correlation between certain wind patterns and soldiers reporting flashbacks. Science fact, wind direction does affect sound travel and pressure levels. Loud noise can seem louder depending on wind angle. Your brain knows this. Your nerves don't care. You lean against the railing and look out at the sea. Somewhere across the water, this all started. Somewhere beyond that, it might all happen again. You think about Franz Ferdinand, not the band, the Archduke, the guy whose assassination was supposed to be the first domino. Scientists still argue whether his death truly caused the war, or just gave it an excuse to show up on time. Either way, he got a lot more press than most of the people who actually died. You sit on a bench carved with names, all locals, all lost between 1914 and 1918. There's a blank space at the bottom, room for more. You wonder if it was left on purpose. A nervous kind of optimism, like the village didn't trust peace to stick around. Quirky tidbit of the day. During WWI, British soldiers used to collect lice from their uniforms and race them for entertainment. They even gave them names and made tiny race tracks. Boredom in the trenches was a force of nature, and lice were just available. You keep walking, your boots crunching against gravel and broken shells. A horse-drawn cart passes you slowly, the driver dozing in the saddle. You wave. He waves back like he's known you all his life. Everyone here shares the same tired expression, like they're all waiting for the sky to fall again. That night, you find shelter in a converted stable. It's been renovated just enough to make it charming without erasing the smell of hay and old leather. You sleep on a straw mattress with a wool blanket that smells like someone else's memories. And as the wind rattles the shutters, you dream of a world where things grow instead of explode. Science fact. Straw absorbs sound better than most modern insulation, which is why the room feels so quiet. Your ears relax, your jaw unclenches, your heartbeat, finally, slows down. In your dream, you're walking through a trench that turns into a garden. Roses grow from shell casings. Barbed wire curls into grapevines. Rats carry tiny watering cans. It's absurd, and yet, your brain is deeply committed to the aesthetic. When you wake, the light is soft. A chicken pecks at your boot like it's trying to pick a fight. You smile and toss it a crumb of old bread. It clucks in surprise, like you've committed an act of great nobility. Somewhere, you hope a historian is writing about this moment. Outside, you meet a young woman painting murals on barn walls. She uses charcoal from burned wood and paints scenes of peace, children laughing, fields in bloom, lovers dancing beneath trees. You ask her why. She says, because people forget fast. I want the walls to remember. You help her mix paint. Your hands, still calloused from the war, feel clumsy with something so gentle. But when you brush a line of sky onto the wall, it feels right. You don't even notice the tear until it lands on your wrist. You wake again with the faint echo of artillery in your ears, even though the nearest guns have long gone silent. It's as if your brain is stuck in a loop, replaying moments like a vintage record scratched just enough to be annoying, but not enough to stop. You rub your eyes, and the morning light spills over the hills, soft and gold, making everything look like a painting someone hurried to finish before bedtime. Today, you're drawn toward the remnants of a battlefield, now overgrown with wildflowers and tangled vines that almost hide the scars beneath. You step carefully over the cracked earth, where trenches once twisted like giant, angry worms beneath your feet. There's a scent in the air, something like damp earth mixed with forgotten memories. You breathe it in. It's strangely comforting, the way nostalgia sometimes is, even when it's about something so grim. You notice the silence here isn't really silence. It's filled with a low hum of insects, the occasional bird call, and the distant lap of a stream. It's easy to forget that this was once a place of chaos, but if you listen closely, you can almost hear the echoes of soldiers' voices, orders barked, and the eerie whistle of shells flying past. Scientists still argue whether the human brain processes trauma better by confronting these haunting places, or by avoiding them altogether. You're somewhere in between, feeling the weight of history without letting it crush you. You find a rusty helmet half buried in the soil and pick it up, turning it over in your hands. It's cold and rough, the metal chipped and scarred, but it carries a story you'll never fully know. A quirky fact floats through your mind. During WWI, pigeons were the unsung heroes, delivering messages across enemy lines. One pigeon, named Cher Ami, saved nearly 200 soldiers by carrying a critical message, despite being shot through the chest. You smile, imagining a tiny bird with a feathered helmet, flying with heroic determination. The war was full of such strange contrasts, horrific destruction mixed with moments of unexpected courage and even humor. Nearby, a wooden sign points to a nearby village that was once a bustling hub for soldiers. You wander through its narrow streets, imagining the soldiers slipping in and out of dimly lit taverns, their faces worn but their spirits clinging to jokes and whispered hopes. The local bakery still uses the same ovens, and the smell of fresh bread momentarily transports you away from the heavy past. You come across a small memorial garden, where poppies bloom in wild abundance, their bright red petals a stark contrast to the muted colors around. The poppy became a symbol of remembrance after the war, inspired by a poem that captured the resilience of these fragile flowers growing through the devastated battlefields. You kneel to touch one, its delicate petals soft against your fingers. There's something almost magical in how life pushes through even the darkest soil. As the afternoon sun warms your skin, you stumble upon an old war diary, left behind or lost, its pages yellowed and fragile. You read a passage about a soldier's dream of home, a warm fire, a mother's voice, the taste of fresh fruit. The words are simple but soaked in longing. You wonder if that soldier ever made it back, or if those dreams were all he carried in the end. Scientists still argue whether reading personal stories like these helps us understand the true cost of war or if it traps us in a cycle of sorrow that's hard to escape. Maybe it's both. You tuck the diary into your bag, a small treasure to carry with you. That evening, you find yourself back near the coastline, watching the sun dip beneath the horizon. The waves whisper secrets you can't quite catch, and the sky blazes with oranges and pinks. A flock of birds spirals overhead, their flight patterns almost like a dance, a reminder that life goes on, despite everything. You sit on a weathered bench, the wood warm from the sun, and close your eyes. You imagine the thousands of soldiers who once sat here, their faces etched with exhaustion and hope, sharing stories to keep the darkness at bay. You breathe deeply, feeling a sense of connection across time. A scientific fact floats to the surface of your mind. Exposure to natural environments like this can reduce stress and improve mental health, something modern soldiers often use in recovery. Maybe the earth itself holds a gentle kind of healing power, if you're willing to listen. You lean back, letting the gentle breeze carry away the tension you didn't realize you were holding. Somewhere far away, a church bell tolls softly, marking time like a heartbeat. And as the light fades, you find yourself drifting into a quiet peace, the echoes of war softened by the calm night. The dawn comes quietly, wrapped in mist that clings to the fields like a whispered secret. You wander through rows of simple white crosses standing silently in neat formation, their smooth marble faces cool under your fingertips. This is a cemetery, but not just any cemetery. It's a resting place for thousands who gave everything in a conflict that reshaped the world. You feel the weight of so many stories pressing gently against the air, each grave a whisper from the past. You notice how the names carved on the stones range from the very young to the older men, some with just initials, others with full names and heartfelt epitaphs. It's strange, the way death can make strangers feel close, as if their bravery and sacrifice echo through time and space to touch you right now. You kneel to pick a small wildflower, growing near one of the graves, a delicate blue blossom that seems almost defiant amid the quiet solemnity. Scientists still argue whether collective mourning through monuments and cemeteries actually helps communities heal, or if it risks trapping grief in a permanent shadow. You're not sure which side you lean toward, but standing here, you can almost feel the tension between remembrance and release. It's a delicate balance, like holding your breath underwater. Too much of either can suffocate you. As you walk along, you hear a faint rustling behind a nearby hedge. Out hops a curious rabbit, its nose twitching as it surveys you like a tiny general inspecting his troops. You chuckle softly, imagining this fluffy creature as the war's most unexpected survivor, hopping through trenches and avoiding gunfire with unshakable luck. During World War I, soldiers often found solace in small moments like these, watching wildlife, or trading jokes to hold back despair. You brush off the image and focus on a small information plaque nearby. It describes how, despite the horror, soldiers sometimes released carrier pigeons to carry messages of hope, or wrote letters home that could never quite express the surreal reality they lived. These communication methods, primitive yet vital, remind you of how technology has always danced hand in hand with warfare, evolving rapidly under pressure. Speaking of technology, the machine gun, scientifically speaking, revolutionized combat during the war. Its rapid-fire capability created a deadly stalemate, turning open fields into killing zones, and trenches into grim fortresses. You can almost hear the rhythmic rat-a-tat-tat echoing through the past, a mechanical heartbeat of relentless danger. It's chilling to think how science intended for progress can so quickly become an instrument of destruction. On a lighter note, here's a quirky tidbit. Some soldiers used to carry small, trench art pieces, items crafted from shell casings or scraps of metal, to pass the time and keep their spirits up. One even fashioned a tiny accordion from discarded parts, playing it softly beneath the mud. It's a reminder that even in the darkest moments, creativity flickers stubbornly alive. You pause at a large oak tree standing sentinel over the graves, its branches swaying gently in the breeze. It's been here since before the war, a silent witness to generations of change. You press your palm against its bark, feeling the rough texture and steady heartbeat of life beneath. Trees like this are nature's own monuments, enduring beyond human conflict. The sun climbs higher, casting long shadows and bathing the scene in warm light. You take a deep breath, tasting the fresh air mixed with faint traces of pine and earth. Your mind drifts to the open question many historians debate. Did the brutal trench warfare break the spirit of the soldiers, or did it forge an unbreakable bond among them? It's a question with no easy answer, much like the tangled roots beneath your feet. As the afternoon draws near, you find yourself near an old chapel built to honor the fallen. Its stained glass windows cast colorful patterns on the stone floor, flickering like ghostly flames. Inside, silence reigns, save for the soft creak of wooden pews, and the occasional drip of water from a leaky roof. You sit quietly, letting the peaceful stillness wash over you. You pull a small piece of chocolate from your pocket, a soldier's small luxury in the trenches, and savor its bittersweet richness. The science behind chocolate's effect on mood is well known. It releases endorphins and serotonin, offering a brief escape from pain. You wonder if those long-ago soldiers found similar comfort in such tiny indulgences amid hardship. As the chapel clock chimes softly, you rise and step outside, greeted by the warm breeze carrying distant laughter and the scent of blooming jasmine. You realize that despite all the sorrow, hope and life persist stubbornly here, entwined with the memories of sacrifice. You take one last look at the peaceful scene before turning away, feeling the slow rhythm of history seep into your bones. The past is never far, and as you walk onward, you carry its lessons quietly with you. You find yourself back among the sprawling fields, the grass swaying gently in the breeze as if whispering secrets only the wind can carry. The air is cooler here, a mix of damp earth and faint traces of smoke long since faded. As you walk, you can almost hear the distant echoes of artillery, the dull rumble and occasional sharp crack. Though you know those sounds belong to history, a ghostly soundtrack playing just beyond your reach. One of the most iconic images from this time is the sight of the trenches themselves. Those long, muddy scars carved into the landscape. You trudge along the narrow wooden walkways, the mud squelching softly beneath your boots. The smell is a peculiar blend of damp wood, sweat, and the ever-present scent of earth turned over and over. It's the smell of endurance, survival, and a very stubborn refusal to give up. Scientists still argue whether the psychological impact of trench warfare created lasting trauma that shaped modern understandings of PTSD, or if the shared hardship somehow fostered a unique camaraderie that helped many soldiers cope. The debate lingers like the fog over these fields, unresolved, complex, and deeply human. You pause to peer over the edge of a trench. Below, the labyrinthine network stretches for miles, zigzagging like a restless serpent beneath the ground. It's hard to imagine the claustrophobic darkness soldiers endured, where mud, rats, and fear were constant companions. Speaking of rats, here's a quirky fact. Some trenches were infested with rats so large they earned nicknames like trench wolves, reputedly bold enough to steal food right from a soldier's hand. It's a slightly absurd, yet grim reminder that life finds a way, even in the worst conditions. The trench wasn't just a ditch, it was a whole ecosystem of survival. Soldiers used duckboards, wooden planks laid on the bottom, to avoid sinking into the mud, which could swallow a man whole. You imagine the frustration of balancing on those slippery boards during a thunderous bombardment, the sound of shells exploding around you like giant firecrackers gone terribly wrong. Your mind wanders to the strange, almost mechanical dance of war technology here. Poison gas, introduced on a massive scale during this conflict, was a terrifying new weapon. The chemical reactions it triggered in the lungs were horrifying, and soldiers had to improvise gas masks from everything from cotton pads to urine-soaked cloth. Yes, urine. The chemical reaction between ammonia and urine and chlorine gas could somewhat neutralize the poison, a grim but fascinating example of battlefield improvisation. And yet, amid these horrors, there were moments of surreal normalcy. You recall stories of Christmas truces, where soldiers from opposing sides emerged cautiously from their trenches, exchanging greetings, food, and even games of soccer. It's a strange, almost unbelievable image of peace blooming briefly in a garden of war. Scientifically, the development of barbed wire and machine guns created a defensive stalemate that made advances slow and costly. The battlefield became a graveyard of repeated attempts, with each side digging in deeper, turning the land into a frozen tableau of struggle. You can almost feel the weight of futility pressing down, heavy as the steel helmets worn by those who fought. As you continue your walk, you spot a small, battered helmet lying half buried in the mud, a silent reminder of someone who passed through here long ago. It's almost poetic, this forgotten piece of metal, once so vital, now just another relic swallowed by the earth. You reach a shallow shell crater filled with rainwater, its surface reflecting the muted gray sky. It feels like a mirror into the past, inviting you to peer deeper into the stories beneath the surface. The water ripples gently, disturbed by a small breeze, carrying the scent of wet stone and fresh grass. Light fades slowly now, and you hear the faint call of an owl somewhere in the distance, a nocturnal observer indifferent to human conflicts. It's a peaceful contrast to the chaos once wrought here, and you take a moment to breathe it in, feeling your body relax as night settles gently over the landscape. Before moving on, here's one last bit of trivia for the day. Soldiers sometimes wore pocket sundials, small, portable devices to tell time in the trenches. A mix of practicality and curiosity, these tiny tools helped men keep track of the endless hours. As days blurred into one another, you keep walking, the ground soft beneath your feet, carrying these fragments of history as you go, each step a quiet tribute to resilience. You wander now into the tangled aftermath of battlefields, where the earth itself seems to remember the violence it has borne. The ground is scarred with countless craters, a pockmarked landscape that feels almost lunar under the soft glow of the setting sun. It's hard not to imagine the thunderous explosions that carved these holes, each one a sudden, violent upheaval of soil and rock, sending shockwaves rippling through both land and soul. One scientific fact that sticks with you here is the sheer energy released by artillery shells, some equal to thousands of pounds of TNT. When one of these detonated nearby, it was as if the ground briefly became a living thing, heaving and groaning under the blast. The power of modern explosives changed warfare forever, turning fields into deadly mazes and sending shockwaves that could rupture eardrums and minds alike. Scientists still argue whether the sheer scale of bombardment during World War I was a cause of widespread shell shock, or if the term masked a more complex set of psychological and physical traumas. The debate around shell shock eventually shaped modern understanding of combat stress disorders. But back then, many soldiers faced stigma and misunderstanding, often branded as cowards for something beyond their control. You feel a strange chill as you imagine the soldiers' ears ringing, their bodies trembling, caught in that invisible blast wave that could leave no visible wounds but cause profound damage inside. One soldier, you recall, described it as being hit by a thunderclap that stays inside your head. It's hard to overstate how new and terrifying this kind of warfare was for the men who fought it. Some troops carried pocket-sized compasses and maps, but the landscape was constantly shifting, sometimes literally swallowed by explosions or heavy rain turning trenches into rivers. Mud became an omnipresent enemy, as much as any human adversary. The mud could stick like glue, pulling boots down and turning the simplest steps into exhausting efforts. Quirky fact alert: certain soldiers became unofficial mud men, covered head to toe in the sticky, gray stuff, sometimes even carrying small shovels to dig themselves out. In some cases, mud preserved lost items for decades, as if the battlefield was trying to hold on to its secrets tightly. And then there were the animals, those unsung companions in the trenches in no man's land. Horses, dogs, and even carrier pigeons played vital roles in communication and supply. Pigeons especially, those feathered little heroes, could fly through hazardous zones to deliver messages when all else failed. Their uncanny homing ability has fascinated scientists for centuries, with some even studying their brain structures to understand navigation. The role of pigeons in the war remains a fascinating, if somewhat overlooked, part of history. You imagine a soldier releasing a pigeon from the muddy trench, watching it disappear into the gray sky, carrying hope and information to far-off commanders. It's a small but poignant reminder of how even in the darkest times, ingenuity and life persist. As night creeps closer, the quiet hum of insects begins to rise, a soft, natural white noise contrasting sharply with the memories of thunderous blasts. The world feels suspended between chaos and calm, and you can almost hear the distant whistle of a passing train, a symbol of industry and change. Before you move on, here's a light-hearted moment. Some soldiers kept small, war gardens near their posts, growing vegetables like carrots or radishes. It was a tiny rebellion against the bleakness, a way to remind themselves that life could still sprout amid destruction. You take a deep breath of the cool evening air, letting the scent of wet earth and fresh grass fill your lungs. The battlefield, though silent now, still speaks in echoes, the stories of those who endured, fought, and sometimes simply survived. You step deeper into the tangled web of alliances and secret treaties that shaped the early days of the war, an invisible battlefield of diplomacy and whispered conversations that carried the weight of entire nations. The map sprawls before you, like a complex puzzle, with countries linked by promises and threats that could ignite or douse flames of conflict. You can almost hear the rustle of papers and the hushed voices of diplomats, trading favors in shadowed rooms, far removed from the muddy trenches and deafening artillery. One mainstream scientific fact that stands out here is the psychological concept of groupthink, where decision-makers, eager to maintain harmony, suppress doubts and dissent, sometimes leading to catastrophic choices. It's a fitting lens through which to view the tangled alliances of pre-war Europe. Leaders, convinced of their own infallibility and caught in this echo chamber, marched their countries toward war with a collective blind spot. Scientists still argue whether the intricate system of alliances was more a deterrent or a tinderbox, as some historians suggest it paradoxically made a large-scale war almost inevitable. Was the network of treaties designed to keep peace, or did it instead create a domino effect once the first piece fell? You ponder how a single assassination, the spark that lit the powder keg, could cascade into a global conflict. You imagine yourself as a spy, slipping between embassies, gathering scraps of information that might hint at the next move. The cloak and dagger atmosphere feels almost surreal, like a spy novel come to life, except the stakes were terrifyingly real. Secret codes, encrypted messages, and double agents added layers of mystery and tension, with intelligence services expanding rapidly as war became a test not just of guns and trenches but of minds and wits. Amidst this serious backdrop, there's a quirky tidbit. Some spies used carrier pigeons fitted with tiny cameras to gather reconnaissance photos, a precursor to modern drone technology. The idea of a bird flying over enemy lines snapping pictures is oddly charming but effective. As night falls, you can almost hear the ticking of clocks, symbolizing how time itself became a weapon and a prisoner in this war. Battles were timed to the minute, plans executed with military precision, yet the war's duration shattered everyone's expectations. Early predictions of a quick victory crumbled under the weight of grinding trench warfare. You picture a weary general staring at maps by candlelight, calculating odds and praying that the next move won't be the one that breaks the fragile morale of his troops. Behind every strategic decision lies the shadow of countless lives, and the burden weighs heavy. A little humor sneaks in. Some generals were notorious for their love of cigars, even in the mud and chaos. Imagine puffing away while dodging shellfire, an oddly calming ritual in a world gone mad. You sense the complexity of this tangled diplomatic web, and how it forever altered the nature of war, not just fought with weapons but also with alliances, secrets, and psychological games. You trudge onward through the endless mire of trench warfare, a landscape so bleak it almost feels alive, mud swallowing boots, barbed wire snagging everything, and the distant thunder of artillery rolling like a relentless storm. You taste the metallic tang of damp earth mixed with sweat and fear. The trenches stretch like scars across the land, a labyrinth where millions of men huddle, waiting, surviving, sometimes dying without a sound. One mainstream scientific fact here is the human body's remarkable capacity to endure extreme stress and hardship. Soldiers in the trenches often face sleep deprivation, malnutrition, and cold, yet many found ways to adapt physically and mentally, sometimes even forming tight-knit communities that offered fleeting solace. Scientists still argue whether the static nature of trench warfare was a result of outdated tactics or an unavoidable response to new technology. The introduction of machine guns and artillery made traditional charges suicidal, forcing armies into a deadly stalemate. But some historians believe commanders could have innovated faster. You imagine the daily grind of trench life, the endless waiting punctuated by brief, horrifying bursts of combat. Rats scuttle past, unbothered by the destruction, growing fat on scraps and worse. Soldiers joke that the rats were bigger than cats, and some even named them as companions, a grim way to hold on to sanity. You can almost hear the muffled laughter mixed with groans, an eerie soundtrack to this limbo between life and death. A quirky tidbit floats up. Some soldiers carried portable gramophones, playing jazz and swing music to boost morale amid the mud and misery. The surreal contrast of upbeat tunes against the backdrop of war is almost comical, music as a lifeline. You envision the innovation that arose from necessity. Periscopes to peek over trenches, tunnels dug beneath enemy lines, and gas masks developed in response to chemical attacks. The horror of poison gas is still fresh in your mind, an invisible enemy creeping through the air, forcing soldiers to don uncomfortable masks that made breathing a chore. Yet, despite the horror, there were moments of unexpected humanity. You recall the famous Christmas truce, when soldiers from opposing sides emerged from their trenches, sharing food, stories, even a game of soccer under a fragile peace. The war is a paradox, brutal and senseless, yet filled with small, defiant acts of kindness and humor. You grin at the thought of a general's cat becoming the unit mascot, sneaking around the trenches and offering comfort. The sensory details pile up, the cold seep of mud, the stench of decay, the sharp crack of rifles, and the fleeting warmth of a shared cigarette. It's a world of contrasts, where life and death coexist in the tight space of a trench. You feel the weight of time again, days stretching endlessly, punctuated by the randomness of survival. The war drags on, relentless and exhausting, testing every limit. You leave the trenches, at least in your mind, and follow the soldiers into the rear lines, where things are slightly less deadly but strange in their own way. There, you encounter a complex web of logistics, working hard to keep millions of soldiers alive, fed, and, on lucky days, equipped with a love letter or two. Each step forward blurs the line between order and chaos. You see horse-drawn carts, and rickety trucks packed with hard bread, ammunition, medical supplies, and sometimes a mandolin case for anyone still optimistic enough to play. Science has a name for this. Large-scale logistical systems, and you really can't underestimate it. Fuel, bullets, food, and water all had to reach the front lines, through mud, shell fire, and some very moody mules. And then there are the field hospitals. You step into a canvas-covered tent where army medics work almost non-stop. One scientific study later noted that frontline doctors often slept less than 4 hours a day during extended campaigns. They wrapped wounds with medicated cotton and hope, performed surgeries under the dim glow of oil lamps, and tried to pull someone back to life with just a bottle of morphine and a bit of optimism. Each bed held a story, a thin chance, and a letter that never got sent. There's a hard-to-believe story of a French nurse who learned to tell artillery types just by ear. She could distinguish German guns from Allied ones by sound alone. Odd. Absolutely. But it was a survival skill, like learning to sleep with one eye open or keeping your hardtack from becoming a blunt weapon. Historians still argue whether the rear lines were what allowed the war to drag on so long. Some claim it was the strength of the supply chains that let the fighting last until 1918. Others believe that resource exhaustion should be forced peace talks earlier. If only someone had admitted they were tired. You pass a ration depot and hear British troops joking about something called bully beef, canned meat, that was equal parts chewy and bland, perfect for building shelter or at least plugging bullet holes. Some even used it to wedge artillery shells into place. War breeds creativity in all the wrong ways. Then there's tin chicken, mail. You see a soldier carefully folding a love letter with muddy fingers. Writing home became ritual, a thin lifeline to the outside world. Modern science shows that even one positive contact from a loved one can dramatically improve resilience under extreme stress. A note from mom, or a scribbled card from a kid's sister, could make a man smile in the middle of shell fire. You pass by a makeshift canvas cafe, where soldiers are handed weak coffee and a square of chocolate like it's a reward. It's not Starbucks, but it's enough to get you out of bed the next day. They play cards, trade jokes about their officers, and occasionally slap on mud masks, not for beauty, but to keep mosquitoes away. And don't forget music. A Scottish soldier blows into his bagpipes, making even a few Germans in the distance look up, either in awe or horror, unclear. A study once found that music in wartime helps regulate heartbeat and reduce anxiety. And if you've ever heard a bagpipe band in a war zone, you'll know it can either save your soul or kill your nap. The world behind the front lines is half real, half dream, a survival hub and a momentary return to humanity. Traveling theater groups performed Shakespeare right next to ammo storage. Soldiers laughed in the dark, their laughter mingling with distant thunder. Bizarre, but also deeply human. You exhale and feel the contradiction sharply. The most dangerous place is also the only place you've seen tenderness. You press your boots into the waterlogged earth of the upper salient, and the moment they sink with that thick, squelchy resistance, you already know you're not getting them back without a fight. Trench foot is a daily gamble here, just one of many delightful souvenirs of the Western Front. The mud clings like it has a crush on you, and won't take no for an answer. Around you, duckboards stretch in drunken zigzags, half submerged by rain, shell fire, and something less mentionable. You trudge forward anyway, because what else is there to do? Welcome to Third Ypres, or Passchendaele, depending on how French or miserable you're feeling. It's 1917, and this battle isn't so much a clash as a mud wrestling match between entire armies. You see soldiers hauling themselves through chocolate pudding terrain, dragging equipment that weighs more than their will to live. Horses sink to their chests, some disappear entirely. And yes, that story you heard, about a tank getting stuck and becoming a temporary bunker. Absolutely true. For 3 days, it served tea out of the loading hatch. The science of mud here is no joke. Soil saturation, combined with artillery churning the ground like a cake mixer, created what's technically known as a thixotropic slurry. Basically, it's quicksand with an attitude problem. One mainstream study from later geologists showed how the local clay absorbed moisture and refused to let it go, turning battlefields into boot-devouring horror films. But here's a fun one. Soldiers swore the mud had a smell, metallic, oily, tinged with decay. A weird fringe theory even claimed the soil released hallucinogenic gases. Scientists still argue whether the right combo of chemicals and rotting matter could trigger mild disorientation. Maybe that's why Private Hawkins tried to propose to a tree last Thursday. And while you're slogging through this swamp of despair, Someone had the brilliant idea to use mustard gas, because if drowning in sludge wasn't dramatic enough, why not add chemical burns and blisters the size of baseballs? You hold your breath through the yellow haze and remember the drill. Mask on in under 5 seconds or you'll be coughing up pieces of your lungs. And that's the polite version. You duck into a dugout carved from soggy chalk, where rats the size of raccoons are playing poker with someone's discarded rations. You try to rest, but artillery hums in the distance like a grumpy god clearing his throat. When the shelling begins again, the air pressure punches your eardrums like a nightclub bass line. You wonder, for a second, if you've actually gone deaf. And weirdly, it's kind of a relief. Some historians argue Passchendaele was a necessary push to break German lines. Others call it a complete waste of life in mud, mostly mud. Scientists still debate whether terrain management could have changed the outcome. Spoiler, when you're fighting in soup, maybe rethink the venue. As night falls, phosphorescent fungi glow faintly along the dugout walls. Bioluminescence, they say. Cold comfort, but strangely pretty. You watch them blink like sleepy fireflies as you lie back on your burlap sack, boots still soaked, skin itchy from lice, and the faint taste of gas in your mouth. You've survived another day. Probably, you're on a train now, but not the kind with snacks and quiet carriages. No, this one's rattling through northern France, packed with stretcher-bearers and groaning men, whose eyes look older than empires. You're in a medical evacuation train, part miracle, part nightmare. Inside, the air smells of antiseptic and singed fabric. Nurses move like ghosts through the narrow corridors, their faces pale under oil lamps swinging with each jolt. You hold the edge of your cot as the train lurches. There's a man across from you missing half a leg and all of his patience. He's telling jokes in French you don't understand, but his laughter is oddly contagious. You look out the window. Dark fields and moonlight blur past like silent witness. The contrast is absurd. Inside, carnage. Outside, peaceful farms and distant cows, pretending none of this is happening. Scientists still argue whether the trauma of the Western Front was worsened by this cognitive dissonance, how your brain tries to reconcile unspeakable violence with the quiet rhythms of normal life just miles away. One curious fact, by 1917, battlefield medicine had developed triage systems we still use today. Casualties were sorted into categories: helpful, if morbid, immediate care, delayed care, or not gonna make it. It made things efficient, but also robotic. You became a file in someone's chart. Tick the wrong box and you're shuffled to the back of the queue. Better hope your nurse had coffee. And yet, medicine advanced in leaps. Blood transfusions were becoming mobile. Portable X-ray machines, thanks Marie Curie, rolled into frontline hospitals. A mainstream study later proved survival rates increased notably with on-site surgical units. Small wins, even in hell. Meanwhile, a fringe theory suggests that morphine-laced chocolates were used to calm patients to panic for injections. Doesn't sound terrible, honestly. Probably beats trench tea. You drift off briefly, only to wake as the train screeches to a stop. They're unloading you now, too gently. That's never a good sign. You're carried to a tent lit in golden haze. Somewhere, a phonograph plays a waltz, like your pain has been invited to a dance. You try to smile. It might be the morphine. A nurse pats your shoulder. Her voice is soft and clipped. British. She tells you to rest. You close your eyes and listen to the steady hum of the canvas flaps in the wind. For a moment, you're not a soldier, just a human in a bed, dreaming of something warmer than war. You're in a field hospital now. It's mostly quiet, save for the creak of canvas, distant murmurs, and the occasional cough. You stare at the seams above you, tracing the lines like constellations. The pain's dulled to a distant pulse, just enough to remind you you're still here. The war's not over, but something has shifted. Rumors of armistice whisper through the wards like wind under a door. You listen closely, hoping, dreading. After all you've seen, hope feels suspicious. You overhear a doctor mutter something about Spanish flu. Scientists still argue whether the close quarters of trench life accelerated its spread. Whatever the cause, it's a new invisible enemy, one that doesn't wear a uniform. Just great. As if your immune system hasn't already checked out. A mainstream medical fact. The 1918 flu pandemic would go on to kill more than the war itself. Talk about irony. But for now, in this moment, you're just focused on peeling a boiled potato with your non-dominant hand, because that's today's rehab. The nurse from earlier returns with a deck of cards. You play silently. She lets you win. You pretend not to notice. The sun cuts through the flap seam in a thin line of gold. You imagine walking out of here. Clean boots, dry clothes, something resembling a plan. The idea of peacetime feels as foreign as the trenches once did. Scientists still argue whether soldiers ever really came home, or just learned to wear a better mask. Someone's brought in a harmonica. A song you can't quite place floats over the beds like smoke. You let it wash over you, your eyelids growing heavier. And now, as the final notes of the harmonica drift away, the scene softens around you. The flickering lamps, the rustling canvas, even the quiet hum of distant thoughts. Everything begins to slow. You feel the weight of the blankets, the faint warmth of the cot beneath you, and a breeze that brushes your face like the whisper of a life waiting patiently outside the war. The images blur, trench lines dissolve into meadow paths, and the mud gives way to warm cobblestones. Boots are light. The air carries no cordite, only lavender. You breathe deeper, slower, steadier. The questions fade. No more. What happens next? Or, will I wake up to gunfire? Just the soft, steady rhythm of sleep pulling you toward its center, a place where time isn't measured by whistles and watches, but by breaths and dreams. You've walked far tonight, through wire and fog, through silence and storm, but here, finally, you get to stop, to rest, and somewhere beyond the edges of your sleep, the war pauses too, just long enough for you to drift fully into peace. End of script. Sweet dreams. The rats here are bold, some the size of house cats, and weirdly well fed. Scientists believe that their rapid breeding cycles, coupled with a surplus of corpses and food waste, made trench rats thrive far better than most humans in this zone. The trench is an ecosystem of its own. Lice are your loyal, annoying companions. They burrow into your clothes and scalp, making sure you never forget they're there. Soldiers call the itching trench fever, and science later confirms it's caused by a bacterium spread through body lice. It doesn't kill you, but it does make you feel like someone is slowly roasting your joints on a spit. Soldiers often burn their uniforms to kill the lice, of course. That doesn't solve the problem, because 5 minutes later, another dozen hitch a ride on someone new. At mealtime, you get the same salty meat and hard biscuits that could probably survive a nuclear apocalypse. The biscuits are so hard you're pretty sure they could stop a bullet, and maybe they did once or twice. Still, you chew, because a full stomach means a stronger will to stay awake, and staying awake means staying alive. You write letters home, or try to, but what do you say? Still here, still cold, still waiting. You decorate the boredom with dry humor. The mud is now part of my soul. You scribble, half laughing, half choking on the irony. Scientists still argue whether humor helps soldiers cope or simply numb them. Maybe both. Maybe that's the only way you get through a war that feels more like a damp, endless camping trip from hell. And then comes the whistle. Not the usual kind. Not the one from a bird or a kettle. This is the whistle. It rises sharp above the low grumble of the trench. You grab your gear, heart doing tiny acrobatics in your chest. You scale the ladder, and just as your helmet crests the surface, you hear it. Artillery, whining through the sky like a banshee on roller skates. You duck instinctively. Nothing hits, yet, but the ground shakes like it's laughing at your caution. Gas masks hang at your side like morbid accessories. Chlorine, phosgene, mustard gas. They each leave a signature. Chlorine burns your lungs and eyes. Mustard gas lingers, blistering skin and turning air into poison. The masks help, kind of, but sometimes the gas just sneaks around them, like a vengeful ghost. Some soldiers urinate on cloths and cover their mouths. The ammonia supposedly neutralizes chlorine. It's not perfect, but then again, nothing about trench life is. When you get downtime, and that's a generous word, you look at photos of home, of green fields not pocked with shell holes, of people smiling without 10 layers of grime on their faces. You hear songs, someone's humming something from back in France or maybe Germany, and for a brief second, you forget that you're part of a war. Did you know some trench networks had built-in chapels? Little shrines carved out with helmets hanging like makeshift chandeliers. Men prayed there, not because they were saints, but because war makes philosophers of even the rowdiest souls. The sun begins to set. It drips red over the rim of the trench, painting the mud in blood tones. You breathe in, hoping the air won't sting this time. It doesn't. For now. A scientist might tell you that the constant stress soldiers endured rewired their brains. Fight or flight became their baseline. A fringe theory even suggests some men began to prefer the trenches because peace felt too quiet, too soft. Scientists still argue whether that's trauma or adaptation. Either way, you lie back down in the dirt, helmet over your eyes. The whistle gone quiet for now. You wait again, because that's what trench life teaches you, to wait. And when you're not waiting, to listen. You pause beneath a camouflaged net draped across a narrow corridor, the fabric fluttering like a ragged curtain. The air smells faintly of damp earth and rusted iron. A nearby shell crater collects rainwater and mosquito eggs in equal measure, creating a weirdly reflective mirror where a bird stops to drink. Funny how even in places made for destruction, nature finds a way to redecorate. The Germans had begun building the Hindenburg Line, or Siegfriedstellung, if you want the official name, in late 1916. They knew the British and French were gaining momentum, and instead of letting the Allies crash against their exhausted front, they chose to retreat. But not in fear. No, they pulled back with the cold precision of someone rearranging chess pieces. When you reach the edge of the forward zone, you notice how every trench bends at odd angles. That's deliberate. So if a shell lands, its blast won't wipe out a whole line of soldiers. The science of carnage, neatly optimized. French theorists have floated the idea that the line's complexity helped prolong the war, not shorten it. There are whispers that secret tunnels beneath the line were used not just for troop movement, but for experiments. Yes, actual military experiments, testing sound waves, trench acoustics, even psychological endurance in darkness. It sounds like a horror film subplot, but then again, this entire war often feels like one long fever dream. Scientists still argue whether these underground networks were exaggerated post-war, or if they really did alter the pace of trench warfare. You continue drifting. Every few steps, you come across something oddly human. A French spoon left behind, a rusted button, a discarded pair of socks tied neatly together. Someone once stood exactly where you are, maybe whispering a joke or a prayer, maybe both. You can almost hear the shuffle of cards, under a tarp during downtime, the low murmur of gossip passed down the trench walls. You picture a soldier tapping out Morse code beneath a blanket, sending the words, still breathing, to a girl somewhere far from the mud and madness. You reach a machine gun nest built into a concrete shelter called a pillbox. Yes, like the mints, except these spit bullets instead of fresh breath. They're squat, round, and terrifying. The Germans reinforced these with steel rods and angled walls to deflect artillery. Their calculations were based on principles of kinetic absorption, a very sciencey way of saying, let's make this thing harder to blow up. Even today, remnants of these pillboxes survive, covered in moss, staring blankly at empty fields. And here's a strange little twist of fate. Many of these bunkers were built by forced labor from occupied territories, Belgians, Poles, and Russians. That detail often slips through the cracks in history books, but it lingers in the stone and steel. The very walls you're brushing your fingers against hold the fingerprints of exhausted men who never chose to be part of this conflict. You can almost feel their breath lingering in the mortar. The Hindenburg Line wasn't invincible forever. Eventually, the Allies broke through it in 1918 in a series of aggressive and costly offensives. But until then, it was a monstrous monument to engineering and obsession. Some of the trenches were 2 stories deep with drainage systems, kitchens, even electric lights powered by generators. At this point, you're practically describing a very sad, muddy airbag. You pass by what used to be a field hospital. The roof has long since collapsed, but the air still smells faintly of old antiseptic and damp linen. A ledger lies cracked open on a shelf, some names crossed out, others underlined. It's both chilling and strangely intimate. Here, lives flickered in and out like matches in the rain. Now you're approaching the rearward zone. This is where the officers stayed, sometimes sipping ersatz coffee made from roasted acorns. Scientific fact, roasting acorns neutralizes their bitterness, making them slightly more palatable, but no amount of alchemy could make them taste like Starbucks. Still, it was a psychological boost. And in war, placebo sometimes works better than truth. Beneath your feet, the ground quivers faintly. Maybe an old memory or just the wind rolling across buried munitions. You take a deep breath. The war is moving again, creeping toward its final chapters. But for now, you're in a place caught between engineering brilliance and human tragedy. The Hindenburg Line, silent tonight, once roared like thunder. You pass by what used to be a field hospital. The roof has long since collapsed, but the air still smells faintly of old antiseptic and damp linen. A ledger lies cracked open on a shelf, some names crossed out, others underlined. It's both chilling and strangely intimate. Here, lives flickered in and out like matches in the rain. Now you're approaching the rearward zone. This is where the officers stayed, sometimes sipping ersatz coffee made from roasted acorns. Scientific fact, roasting acorns neutralizes their bitterness, making them slightly more palatable, but no amount of alchemy could make them taste like Starbucks. Still, it was a psychological boost, and in war, placebo sometimes works better than truth. Beneath your feet, the ground quivers faintly, maybe an old memory or just the wind rolling across buried munitions. You take a deep breath. The war is moving again, creeping toward its final chapters. But for now, you're in a place caught between engineering brilliance and human tragedy. The Hindenburg Line, silent tonight, once roared like thunder. You pass a sign half buried in dirt. The German words have faded, but someone scratched into the wood in English, "We were here." It's a fitting echo, a final wink from history as the trenches begin to dissolve into shadow. And you keep walking, quietly, slowly, because the war doesn't stop. But for this moment, it softens just enough to let you breathe. The horizon is drowsy now, glazed in the soft gold of a dying sun, and the war you're walking through seems to stretch and yawn like it, too, is ready to collapse. But you don't get to rest just yet. You're now threading your way through a pocket of France that became infamous in 1917 for two things: epic failure and total mutiny. Welcome to the Nivelle Offensive, also known as that time France tried to end the war in 48 hours and ended up sparking a nationwide breakdown. You step onto chalky soil near the Chemin des Dames Ridge, where General Robert Nivelle convinced everyone that a grand frontal assault would break German lines within 48 hours. Bold claim. Scientific optimism, maybe, but probably more like blind confidence dressed in a uniform. The plan was a massive artillery barrage followed by a rapid infantry wave, cutting through German defenses like a knife through a baguette. But the enemy, they had bunkers, deep ones, carved right into limestone hills, like stone termites. The Germans had tunneled entire fortresses underneath, immune to shells. You crouched near the mouth of one of these old bunkers. It's wide enough to park a carriage and deep enough to echo your breath. Inside, it's as dark as the humor soldiers clung to during the offensive. A candle stub still sits in a wall crevice, melted down to a sad puddle of wax. Someone had hoped it'd last longer than the attack did. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some of those underground hideouts had built-in pipe organs, played by German troops in downtime. Can you imagine? One moment, artillery is pounding the surface, and beneath it all, Bach. The French soldiers, they weren't so lucky. They charged uphill into machine guns, pouring over trenches in what looked like desperation ballet. The result was catastrophic. Nearly 200,000 casualties in just a few weeks. One soldier wrote in his journal, "We marched through blood thick as soup." Scientists still argue whether it was poor strategy, overconfidence, or simply the weather that doomed the operation. Rain turned everything to glue. Weapons jammed. Maps smeared. The only thing that moved with ease was fear. That fear turned to fury. And here's where it gets spicy. About 40,000 French soldiers refused to fight afterward. Yes, full-on mutiny. They didn't burn flags or start a revolution. No, they just sat down, refused orders, sang songs, demanded leave, decent food, and, shockingly, basic human treatment. Some units put white flowers in their rifle barrels. One platoon marched the wrong way entirely, shouting, "We're not meat." You step over what used to be a mess hall, now swallowed by ivy and soil. Somewhere beneath the weeds lies a fork stamped with RF for Republique Franoise, probably stolen, probably fought over. You remember hearing about how prized decent cutlery was in the trenches. Funny what people cling to when the world's falling apart. Eventually, The French High Command had to do something. Soldiers couldn't exactly yelp their dissatisfaction, so a few ringleaders were court-martialed, some executed, though fewer than myths suggest. Most were quietly reassigned, and Nivelle, he got the boot, replaced by General Philippe Pétain, who wisely realized that screaming orders at exhausted humans wasn't strategy, it was just noise. Pétain gave the troops longer rest, better food, and, yes, actual leave. The front stabilized. Morale crept back like warmth under a heavy blanket. And the mutiny. It's often painted as shameful, but in hindsight, it was a rare act of collective sanity, a mass nap protest in the face of madness. As you walk, a night breeze kicks up chalk dust, and it stings your nose in that oddly satisfying way, like when you open an old book, and it smells like secrets. You pass an old dugout with slogans etched inside. Mort de la guerre, death to war, and, less poetically, send wine. And here's your science fact for the night. During the offensive, pigeons were still one of the fastest ways to relay messages. A famous bird named La Valente carried word of a trapped unit, under fire, and became a minor national hero. Pigeon communication, a reminder that sometimes feathery determination beats all the brass in the world. You rest for a moment beside the ruins of a horse stable, now overtaken by nettles and blue wildflowers. The horses are long gone, of course, but you can still hear the echo of hooves and harnesses, the creak of carts dragged through sludge. Mules, actually, did most of the dirty work. Stronger and grumpier than horses, they were the real MVPs of supply lines. Your foot grazes a rusted helmet, one of the iconic Adrian models, painted horizon blue. Its rim is dented, possibly by shrapnel or just time. You wonder what the soldier who wore it was thinking the day everything broke down. Did he mutter curses, whisper songs, pray to ghosts? The war is reshaping itself again. New leadership, new tactics, new hope. But something fundamental cracked during the Nivelle offensive. A belief, maybe even a myth, that industrialized armies could win by sheer will. That logic died on the Chemin des Dames. And as you look up at the stars, sprinkled like salt across black velvet, it occurs to you that even the sky watched quietly as men marched into madness for 48 promised hours and never really came back. The bitter taste of mud and smoke lingers in the air as you trudge forward, your boots sinking into the churned-up earth like it's swallowing time itself. You're moving away from the haunting silence of the Nivelle offensive and into the throes of 1918, the final year of this nightmare ballet that's been grinding continents and souls alike. This is the year when the war decided it would no longer linger. It would sprint to its bitter end. And the stage for this final act, the Western Front, still scarred, still soaked in sorrow, yet suddenly pulsing with a desperate urgency. You find yourself near Amiens, a town that became the heart of what the Allies called the 100 Days Offensive. It's a patchwork of shattered buildings and hopeful eyes. Soldiers from France, Britain, Canada, Australia, and yes, the fresh-faced Americans, are all jumbled together like a restless crowd at a never-ending party that no one wants to attend but nobody can leave. You might hear laughter mingled with tension here, a surreal cocktail. Here's a curious fact. During this offensive, the Allies used tanks more effectively than ever before. But did you know some crews trained their metal beasts to navigate mud so deep? The machines seemed to be swimming rather than rolling. Science says the tank's caterpillar tracks spread their weight enough to avoid sinking. But engineers still battled nature's grip, trying to perfect this early all-terrain vehicle. Those first tanks were noisy, stinky, and prone to breaking down, but they became a terrifying symbol of industrial warfare's relentless push forward. As you move closer to the front lines, you notice a strange pattern in the landscape. There are patches where the grass refuses to grow, where shells exploded in violent bouquets of dirt and debris. But then, in the cracks between, tiny flowers poke up, forget-me-nots, dandelions, stubborn little soldiers of nature that laugh quietly at destruction. Scientists still argue whether these wildflowers' survival is a sign of nature's resilience, or just an accident of soil chemistry. Either way, they're a gentle reminder that life insists on continuing, even in the harshest of places. Your boots crush a patch of these fragile blooms as you pass by a ramshackle dugout, where a Canadian sniper once kept a journal. The pages are lost to time, but the soldiers talked about him as a ghost, silent and seen, deadly accurate. Snipers were the weird outlaws of trench warfare. Their skill a mix of cold science, nerves, and a touch of madness. Some soldiers claimed these sharpshooters could hear a twig snap a mile away, though that's probably exaggeration, or at least wishful thinking from those nervously poking their heads over the trench edge. Amid the chaos of shellfire and shouted orders, you might chuckle at the fact that some troops developed their own unique slang. British soldiers called German artillery whiz-bangs because of the sound shells made zipping overhead, like a sinister jazz riff. And then there's the American doughboys, fresh and eager, calling everything the real McCoy, probably just to sound cooler among seasoned veterans. Language, you see, was just another weapon, a way to claim sanity in the insanity. The 100 Days Offensive was a masterclass in combined arms tactics, infantry, artillery, tanks, and aircraft all choreographed to move like a giant mechanical beast. For example, planes dropped messages, spied on enemy positions, and sometimes even strafed trenches with machine guns. It was an early form of air power that still had plenty of bugs to work out, like pilots fumbling with parachutes or getting lost mid-flight. The war was teaching humanity how to fight from the sky, but at a cost that still makes you blink in disbelief. In one small village you pass through, there's a sign nailed to a shattered door reading, "Welcome to the Somme." You've heard of the Somme. It's a name heavy enough to sink ships. A battle that began in 1916, but whose scars lingered like ghosts, reminding everyone that even after 2 years, some wounds refuse to heal. Scientists still argue whether the Somme was a pointless bloodbath or a grim necessity that wore down the German army. It's a question without a clear answer, much like the war itself. Near the outskirts, a group of soldiers gathers around a makeshift stove, swapping stories over thin soup. One of them pulls out a harmonica, and a soft tune drifts through the cold air. Music was a rare balm, a brief human connection amid mechanized death. You imagine the song echoing between the trees, a fragile thread tying together strangers who probably won't see tomorrow. Your eyes catch a glimpse of a small, makeshift graveyard, simple wooden crosses leaning in the wind. It's quiet here, peaceful, except for the occasional whisper of the wind through the barbed wire. You kneel and brush a hand over a cross marked "Unknown Soldier." For every name and number, there are countless more who vanished into the fog of war, lost to memory and history. And yet, here they rest, silent witnesses to the cost of human ambition. As you stand, the sun dips low, bathing the battlefield in soft amber light. You can almost hear the war itself exhaling, exhausted but not yet defeated. The final chapters are being written now, with every step forward soaked in hope, fear, and an aching desire for peace. You sense that change is coming, slow, uneven, but inevitable. And here's your quirky fact for tonight. During these final pushes, some soldiers used carrier pigeons with tiny cameras strapped to their backs to spy on enemy lines. Early aerial reconnaissance, but feather-powered. Science says these birds could fly up to 60 miles per hour, navigating by Earth's magnetic field, a skill that still fascinates researchers today. You walk on, the ground softening beneath your feet as you near the edge of the front. The sounds of battle fade into a gentle hush, broken only by distant birdsong and the rustling of leaves. Somewhere nearby, a soldier hums a lullaby, a whispered promise that this nightmare will end, that dawn will come. You keep moving forward, the quiet after the storm pressing in around you, like a thick blanket. The last battles of the war are unfolding with a strange mixture of desperation and determination, like a finale where everyone's holding their breath. The war is nearly over, but the scars it has left are still raw beneath the surface. You can almost feel the weight of history bearing down on your shoulders, as if the ground itself remembers every footstep, every shout, every whispered prayer. The German forces are retreating, worn down by relentless pressure and dwindling supplies. You might be surprised to learn that this retreat was one of the fastest and most chaotic in modern military history. Trains overloaded with troops trundle down tracks humming with panic, while others flee on foot through muddy fields and shattered villages. The pace of this collapse was so sudden that some commanders barely had time to issue orders. Scientists still argue whether it was strategic genius or sheer exhaustion that broke the stalemate, probably a messy mix of both. Amidst this turmoil, you stumble across a curious sight, a group of German soldiers releasing thousands of lanterns into the twilight sky. This was a common practice called light release, meant to signal retreat or confuse enemy aircraft. The glowing orbs float like fireflies, flickering against the darkening sky. The science behind these lanterns is simple. Hot air lifts the paper vessels, but the effect is eerily poetic. It's as if these soldiers are sending tiny messages of hope or farewell, a fleeting beauty in the midst of destruction. Nearby, the famous Meuse-Argonne offensive rages on. This massive Allied push is one of the bloodiest campaigns of the entire war, involving over 1 million American troops. You might chuckle at the nickname, Doughboys, that stuck to these fresh-faced Americans, though no one seems quite sure where it originated. Some say it's because of their rounded uniform buttons. Others argue it's a carryover from earlier cavalry slang. Whatever the truth, these soldiers are learning fast that war is nothing like the training grounds. As you trudge through the broken forest and shell-pocked earth, you spot a tree scarred with bullet holes and shrapnel marks. It's called the Lone Sentinel by some soldiers, a silent witness that somehow survived the barrage. Scientists still debate whether trees like this can actually heal themselves over time or if they simply adapt and endure damage in unique ways. Regardless, this battered giant stands as a symbol of resilience amidst chaos. You pause to watch a squad of medics at work, rushing between the trenches carrying stretchers with wounded men. Their job is brutal, often thankless, and incredibly dangerous. Interestingly, many medics carried special whistles to call for help or warn of incoming shellfire, an early form of battlefield communication. It's a stark reminder of how science and innovation were deeply woven into the grim daily realities of war. Nearby, soldiers exchange stories over coffee brewed from whatever they can find. Humor, it seems, was one of the few weapons that didn't run out. One tale you overhear involves a German soldier who tried to escape capture by disguising himself as a chicken. Yes, a chicken. Whether true or exaggerated, it's a bizarre anecdote that brings a brief smile amid the shadows. You make a mental note to never underestimate the power of absurdity in tough times. As the sun dips below the horizon, the sounds of battle fade into a distant rumble. You feel the subtle shift in the air, a mixture of relief and lingering dread. The war is nearing its final bow, but peace still seems a fragile dream. You think about the millions who have marched, fought, and fallen on this soil. Their stories, like the glowing lanterns, will drift into memory, sometimes bright, sometimes dim, but never forgotten. And here's your fringe tidbit for tonight. Some soldiers believe that certain animals, like cats or dogs, could sense impending shellfire or gas attacks. While science hasn't fully explained this behavior, anecdotal evidence from the trenches suggests that animals often behaved oddly before explosions. Maybe they picked up vibrations humans couldn't, or maybe it was just war's strange way of making everything feel just a bit more uncertain. You take a deep breath, smelling the faint scent of smoke, mixed with earth and something almost floral, perhaps those stubborn wildflowers from before. It's a reminder that even here, life persists, quietly weaving through the threads of destruction. With your boots heavy but your spirit quietly steady, you move onward, stepping lightly into the fading light, carrying the weight of a world at war, but also the hope for what comes after. You press on, the horizon stretching wide with a mix of smoke and dawn's pale light. The final chapter of the war is closing in fast, like the last pages of a gripping book. You almost don't want to finish. The mood is strange, part exhaustion, part tense anticipation, as armies prepare for one last, massive push. It's a bit like waiting for a thunderstorm to break, knowing it will come, but unsure exactly when or how hard. The Allied forces have begun what historians now call the 100 Days Offensive, a relentless series of attacks aimed at breaking the German lines for good. You walk alongside weary soldiers moving through a landscape that looks more like a moonscape than Earth, craters, mud, twisted metal, and the occasional ghostly remnants of once sturdy buildings. The air smells of wet earth and something metallic, a constant reminder of the machinery that reshaped this battlefield. Science offers a fascinating tidbit here. The introduction of tanks in these final battles revolutionized ground warfare. These lumbering beasts, covered in steel plates and churning through mud, brought a new dimension to the fight. You probably wouldn't want to be inside one, though. Temperatures inside could soar above 50 degrees Celsius, and ventilation was practically non-existent. Soldiers joke that riding in a tank was like sitting in a sauna while being shot at. Scientists still argue whether tanks were decisive in ending the war, or more of a psychological weapon. As you move through the trenches, you notice how communication technology had evolved, with field telephones and runners keeping lines open despite constant shelling. But sometimes, messages got hilariously garbled. A famous case involved a commander receiving an order to attack at dawn, which got misheard as attach a fawn. No one sent out a deer, but you can imagine the confusion that caused. These little errors remind you that even amid chaos, human error and humor persist. You come across a field hospital tent, where nurses work tirelessly to patch up the wounded. The scene is almost surreal. Beds lined with men from different countries, languages mixing in the air like an uneasy melody. The nurses' hands move with practiced precision, yet there's a softness to their care that cuts through the harshness of war. You learn that many women, who served as nurses during WWA, helped pioneer modern emergency medicine, developing triage systems still in use today. Near the hospital, a group of soldiers gather around a makeshift radio, listening to music broadcasted from home. The melodies of jazz and folk songs feel oddly out of place but somehow comforting. Music, it seems, was one of the few things that could momentarily transport soldiers away from the mud and blood. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some soldiers even formed small bands using scavenged instruments. Imagine a trumpet made from a shell casing, or drums from empty cans. Scientists still argue how much music truly affected morale, but its power to connect hearts in dark times is undeniable. You pause to watch a platoon preparing for a charge. Their faces are set with grim determination, but you notice the occasional nervous grin or shared joke. Humor, you realize again, is like a secret weapon soldiers carry deep inside. One story tells of a soldier who hid a rubber chicken in his pack, claiming it was his lucky charm. It probably didn't stop bullets, but it certainly kept spirits up. The sun climbs higher now, and you feel the shift in the air as the battle roars back to life. Shells explode in the distance, earth trembles underfoot, and the rhythm of war marches relentlessly forward. The ground you tread holds echoes of countless stories, of courage, fear, friendship, and loss. You breathe deeply, tasting the cool morning air, and think about how science today uses battlefield data from WWI to understand trauma and PTSD better. The war wasn't just fought on fields but also in minds, a struggle whose effects rippled for decades. As you step forward, the quiet promise of an ending feels almost within reach, but you know the journey is far from over. War has a way of bending time, making moments stretch and contract unpredictably. And you, walking through this chapter of history, are caught in that strange flow. You trudge through a landscape forever marked by the scars of war, trenches carved deep into the earth, shell craters like moon pockmarks, and shattered trees standing like skeletons against the gray sky. It's strange how nature stubbornly pushes back, with grass and wildflowers creeping through the debris, a quiet reminder that life keeps nudging forward even in the darkest places. This resilience feels almost hopeful, like a whispered promise amid the chaos. The final Allied offensives continue to ripple across the Western Front. You watch soldiers coordinating artillery barrages and infantry advances with a precision born of bitter experience. The mechanization of war, fully realized now, fills the air with the constant clatter of machine guns, the drone of planes overhead, and the low rumble of tanks. It's a brutal symphony, relentless and unforgiving. Here's a scientific nugget. The chemical warfare introduced earlier in the war still haunts these fields. Mustard gas, that invisible, creeping menace, causes blistering burns and blindness. The soldiers' gas masks, though lifesavers, are uncomfortable and imperfect, sometimes fogging up at the worst moments. Scientists still argue about the ethics and long-term effects of chemical weapons, but the devastation they wrought is undeniable. You spot an unusual sight, a carrier pigeon, wings glistening, tethered and ready to deliver a message. These feathered couriers were crucial when wires snapped or radios failed. It's almost poetic how these birds risked everything, flying through storms and gunfire to keep vital communication alive. A quirky fact: some pigeons were awarded medals for their bravery. Talk about a feather in one's cap. Nearby, you overhear soldiers debating the war's end, Hopeful whispers tangled with exhaustion. The debate among historians about the war's true cause bubbles up in your mind. Was it the tangled alliances, nationalism, or simply the spark of a Sarajevo assassination? Scientists still argue about which factor was most decisive, but you realize it's probably a mix, like a complex recipe no one wanted to taste. You pass a field kitchen, the smell of stewed meat and hardtack briefly breaking the monotony of mud and metal. Food was a rare comfort, and soldiers prized their rations as treasure. Sometimes, they'd trade small items, a chocolate bar here, a piece of chewing gum there, creating a small economy amid the madness. You smile thinking about how even in war, human nature sneaks in, always finding ways to barter and bond. A group of soldiers share a quiet moment, writing letters home. Their handwriting is shaky, the words sometimes halting, but the emotion is clear. Letters were lifelines, carrying love and hope across the miles. You think about how today's instant messages have replaced these paper lifelines, but maybe they lack some of the weight that comes with pen and paper. You spot a battlefield artist sketching scenes with quick, sure strokes. These unofficial war artists captured moments that photos couldn't, moments of quiet, of fear, and fleeting beauty. Their works now offer a window into the human side of conflict, a reminder that even amid destruction, art persists. As the day stretches on, the distant thunder of artillery never ceases. The smell of wet earth, sweat, and burnt cordite hangs heavy, mingling with the softer scent of pine and wildflowers daring to grow. It's a strange blend of destruction and renewal, much like the war itself. You realize that while the war rages, history is being shaped, not just by generals and politicians but by every soldier, nurse, pigeon, and artist caught in this vast, grinding machine. And you, wandering through these scenes, carry their stories forward. You move slowly through the shadow of what was once a thriving town, now reduced to rubble and ghostly silence. The echoes of laughter and daily life seem almost cruel in contrast to the present desolation. As you step carefully over broken bricks and twisted metal, you notice the faint outlines of homes, schools, and markets, all swallowed by the relentless advance of war. The earth here feels tired, as if it has absorbed too much suffering to ever fully heal. The soldiers around you carry the weight of months, sometimes years, of fighting etched into their faces. Their eyes betray exhaustion and a quiet desperation, but also an unspoken resolve. You catch glimpses of camaraderie, brief moments of humor exchanged over shared cigarettes, or the struggle to find a patch of dry ground. It's these small human touches that keep the relentless machine of war from completely consuming the spirit. One scientific fact drifts through your thoughts: the impact of prolonged stress on the human body. Soldiers' cortisol levels spike continuously, leading to fatigue and sometimes shell shock, which we now recognize as PTSD. Scientists still argue about the best ways to treat these invisible wounds, but their effects are undeniable and long-lasting. Nearby, a soldier pulls out a harmonica, its worn surface gleaming faintly in the dim light. The melancholy tune rises softly, a fragile moment of peace amid chaos. You recall reading that music was often used therapeutically during the war to boost morale and ease anxiety, a quirky but comforting detail in a world turned upside down. You overhear a debate among the troops about what the future holds. Some cling to hope for peace, while others brace for an uncertain aftermath. The question of how the war will reshape borders, politics, and society is hotly contested not only on the battlefield but in scholarly circles too. Scientists still argue whether the Treaty of Versailles would sow the seeds of lasting peace or future conflict. Passing a makeshift medical tent, you catch the smell of antiseptic mingling with earth and sweat. Medics work tirelessly, stitching wounds and comforting the wounded with steady hands and kind words. Medical advances like antiseptics and blood transfusions are saving lives, yet infections still claim many. It's a stark reminder that even in the early 20th century, science was racing to catch up with the brutal reality of modern warfare. As dusk falls, you find yourself surrounded by the quiet chorus of crickets and distant artillery. The night promises no real rest, but for a moment, the world seems to hold its breath. You lean back, eyes tracing the darkening sky, and realize that every whisper of wind, every flicker of starlight, carries the weight of untold stories, stories of courage, loss, and the stubborn hope for a dawn after darkness. You trudge through the muddy trenches once more, the cold seeping into your bones like an uninvited guest. The mud clings to your boots, thick and unyielding, and the air smells of damp earth mixed with something sharper, smoke, gunpowder, and sweat. Around you, the groan of distant artillery forms a low, persistent soundtrack, while overhead, clouds drift sluggishly across a sky heavy with the threat of rain. It's the kind of setting that would inspire a gloomy painting, if anyone had the luxury to think about art here. A scientific fact drifts into your mind. The trench warfare of World War I was unique in its brutal static nature, a deadly stalemate that stretched for miles. The trenches themselves created a micro-ecosystem. Rats, lice, and disease flourished in the dank conditions, making survival a matter not just of avoiding bullets but bacteria. Scientists still argue whether the trench design was the best possible strategy or a disastrous mistake that prolonged suffering needlessly. You spot a rat scuttling across a puddle, its beady eyes reflecting the pale light. These creatures became infamous during the war, growing to enormous sizes, feeding on the dead, and spreading typhus. Soldiers joked about their rats, the size of cats, but the reality was grim. Still, some found dark humor in naming these pests, a tiny rebellion against the endless misery. A sergeant nearby pulls out a pocket watch, checking the time with meticulous care. Time itself seemed warped in the trenches. Minutes stretched into hours with nothing to do but wait, while seconds could explode into chaos in a barrage or raid. This paradox plays tricks on your mind, a blend of boredom and adrenaline that soldiers had to master to keep going. You overhear whispers about the new technology creeping into the war: tanks, flamethrowers, and airplanes. These innovations promised to break the deadlock, but brought new horrors in their wake. Scholars still debate whether technological advancement accelerated the scale of death or ultimately saved lives by shortening battles. As night falls, the temperature drops further, and you pull your coat tighter. The camaraderie you glimpsed earlier becomes more vital than ever. Around a flickering lantern, a group shares stories and dry biscuits, their laughter fragile but genuine. Moments like this, brief and flickering, become a kind of light in the dark, proof that even amid mechanized slaughter, humanity clings to hope. You close your eyes for a moment, hearing the soft murmur of voices and the distant rumble of artillery fade into a lullaby of rain on tin and mud. Somewhere, a soldier hums a tune you recognize, a melody that feels both haunting and strangely comforting. The night stretches on, endless and unknowable, but for now, it holds you gently, like a tired sigh. You wake to the chill before dawn, the trenches wrapped in a heavy fog that blurs shapes into ghostly outlines. The air feels thick and still, as if the world is holding its breath before the inevitable chaos. Around you, soldiers move quietly, their faces pale and drawn, but alert, their breath visible in the cold morning air. The smell of wet wool and damp earth saturates everything, grounding you in this harsh and forgiving reality. Scientific fact drifts to your awareness. The widespread use of poison gas in World War I introduced a new, terrifying element to warfare. Chlorine and mustard gas could linger in the trenches, invisible and deadly, a silent killer that soldiers had to detect by smell or sight. Despite advances in gas masks, many suffered painful, lingering injuries, and scientists still argue whether chemical weapons crossed an ethical line that changed war forever. You catch a strange glint as the first light hits shattered glass, and barbed wire tangled like a nightmare sculpture. The no man's land between trenches is a graveyard of broken dreams and twisted metal, a place where courage and terror dance together. It's said some soldiers tried to collect souvenirs, shards of shell casing, fragments of enemy helmets, as grim trophies of survival. A sergeant pulls you aside, voice low but urgent, briefing you on the day's plans. Artillery will soften the enemy lines before an infantry assault attempts to push forward. The soldiers' faces tighten with the knowledge that many will not return. The open scholarly debate about these offensives questions whether the staggering human cost ever justified the few meters gained, or if commanders simply repeated the same deadly mistakes. As the first shells begin to fall, you brace yourself against the shaking earth. The cacophony of explosions, shouts, and machine gun fire swells around you, an overwhelming storm of noise and fear. Yet beneath it all, you notice an odd detail, the strangely rhythmic pattern of the artillery, almost like a brutal, pounding heartbeat. It's a harsh reminder that science and strategy pulse through even the most chaotic moments of war. Through the haze, you glimpse the faces of fellow soldiers, some steely with resolve, others wide-eyed with raw terror. Amid this whirlwind, brief acts of kindness emerge, a shared cigarette, a whispered word of encouragement, a hand steadied on a trembling shoulder. These small human connections become a lifeline amid the violence. As the barrage dies down and the order to advance echoes, you feel the weight of every step, the crunch of mud beneath boots, the sharp tang of fear mixing with adrenaline. The day stretches ahead, uncertain and perilous, but you move forward, part of a relentless tide in a war that reshapes the world. The aftermath of battle leaves you trudging through a surreal landscape, a morass of mud, shattered wood, and twisted metal that clings to your boots like a second skin. The once vivid cries of combat now fade into an eerie silence, interrupted only by distant moans or the occasional sharp bark of a war dog. Around you, the trenches lie scarred and crumbling, reminders of brutal days past, each dugout a testament to the endurance of those who endured. One curious scientific fact settles in your mind: trench foot, a debilitating condition caused by prolonged exposure to damp, unsanitary conditions, plagued thousands of soldiers. Your feet ache in protest against the relentless cold and moisture, and you understand why maintaining dry feet was a constant battle. Interestingly, some soldiers resorted to applying whale oil as a crude but effective preventative measure. Scientists still argue whether trench foot was due mainly to poor hygiene, or simply the unavoidable nature of trench life. The eerie quiet contrasts sharply with the oddities you notice, like the presence of glowworms flickering in the dark corners of abandoned dugouts, or the occasional rat brazen enough to scurry past your boots, unfazed by the human misery around them. These creatures thrived in the trenches, some growing fat on scraps, while others spread disease. There's a fringe theory that rats may have even played a role in soldiers' dreams, symbolizing decay and the ever-present threat of death in the trenches. Scholars continue debating the psychological impact of these conditions, questioning whether the persistent dampness and filth contributed more to soldiers' mental collapse than the horrors of combat itself. You feel the weight of this possibility as you pull your coat tighter, the dampness seeping into your bones and dragging your spirits down. Yet, amid the grimness, there's an unexpected beauty. The way the morning mist clings to shattered wire, sparkling like frozen tears in the weak sunlight, or how the distant call of a lone bird pierces the fog with fragile hope. These small moments seem almost defiant against the surrounding desolation. You catch yourself chuckling softly, imagining how trench rats might organize their own secret societies beneath the battlefield. Maybe they hold little rat councils, debating the best routes to scavenge or which soldiers are too slow to catch. It's a dark humor, but humor nonetheless, a tiny light flickering in an otherwise bleak world. As you pull your boots free from a sticky patch of mud, you realize that survival here is less about heroics and more about enduring the unbearable. Each small act of care or caution a thread holding you together in this fragile tapestry of war. You rise from the damp earth and press forward, feeling the crunch of shattered wood and wire underfoot. The air thick with the fog of dust, smoke, and the faint metallic tang of rusted shells. The no man's land stretches ahead, a bleak, barren expanse, where once vibrant fields and villages stood, now erased by relentless artillery bombardment. You trudge carefully, mindful of hidden craters, and the occasional glint of unexploded ordnance, a silent threat lurking beneath the mud. Here's a scientific fact to calm your mind. The intense bombardments generated shockwaves that literally shook the earth beneath you, sometimes causing tremors felt miles away. These shockwaves disrupted the soil, creating a landscape so unstable that even walking could feel like stepping on a jelly. You imagine how the earth itself must have groaned under such relentless punishment. Now, here's a quirky tidbit. During lulls in fighting, soldiers often spotted peculiar phenomena called squakes, mysterious booms, that seemed to come from the atmosphere, baffling both soldiers and scientists of the day. Some thought they were secret new weapons. Others joked that the sky itself was angry. Today, scientists still debate whether these were caused by atmospheric conditions or distant artillery echoes. But at the time, these sounds added a surreal layer to the chaos. You notice the strange silence in no man's land, broken only by the occasional flapping of torn banners caught in the wind. It's easy to forget that this scarred ground once bore the weight of everyday life, farmers tending crops, children playing beneath open skies. Now, it's a ghostly reminder of what was lost. Despite the devastation, small signs of life persist. Tiny wildflowers, poppies mostly, poke through the cracked earth, their bright red petals stark against the gray mud. You recall that these poppies would later become symbols of remembrance, a poignant reminder of resilience amid destruction. As you move cautiously, you step over a discarded helmet, its faded insignia a silent story of a soldier who once called this place home. There's a shadow of melancholy that settles over you, mixed with an odd fascination. How nature and memory intertwine here in the ruins of war. Amid the grit and sorrow, you manage a quiet joke to yourself. Maybe the earth is just trying to shake off the grime of human conflict, like a dog shedding water after a bath. It's a small comfort, a brief escape from the heaviness pressing down on your shoulders. You keep walking, each step a testament to endurance in a landscape that refuses to heal, yet somehow still breathes. You press onward through the shattered remnants of trenches, where the stench of damp earth mixes with the faint, sour odor of decayed wood and rusted metal. The trenches, once bustling arteries of survival and strategy, now lie eerily quiet, their sides crumbling, the wooden supports slick with mold. You can almost hear the ghosts of whispered plans and muffled cries, the muffled rhythm of boots and whispered commands, echoing faintly in your mind like a half-remembered dream. Here's a scientific fact to steady your thoughts. The trenches acted as a crude form of insulation, protecting soldiers from the bitter cold that could plunge well below freezing during winter months. The compacted earth walls absorbed some of the temperature swings, creating microclimates that sometimes allowed for tiny fungi and mosses to grow, odd little pockets of life amid the ruin. Now, for a quirky tidbit, in some sectors, soldiers kept small pets, mostly cats and dogs, to chase away rats and lift morale. These unofficial mascots became beloved companions, with some soldiers claiming their pets had uncanny sixth senses for danger. Scientists still argue whether these claims were just hopeful superstition, or if animals truly picked up on subtle cues invisible to human senses. The labyrinthine trenches twist and turn, their narrow corridors often ankle-deep in mud or stagnant water. You imagine the soldiers' boots sloshing through the muck, the constant drip of water from sandbags overhead, and the distant roar of artillery that never quite seems to stop. The air here carries a heavy weight, thick with the musk of sweat, unwashed bodies, and the lingering trace of gunpowder. Occasionally, you spot scratched initials on wooden planks, hearts carved into bark, or small tokens left behind, a makeshift shrine to loved ones far away. These personal marks are whispers of humanity in an otherwise mechanical, brutal landscape. You reflect on how even in the darkest places, people seek connection and meaning. A dry humor flickers in your mind. Trenches are like underground cities, where nobody really wants to live, and the only nightlife is a rat party. You chuckle softly, the sound swallowed by the silence around you. As you navigate further, you notice the ingenious engineering. Duckboards laid down to help feet avoid sinking too deep into the mud, cleverly designed fire steps for quick exits, and sandbags stacked like medieval battlements. Despite the horror, there's a strange beauty in this human attempt to tame chaos. Your footsteps echo softly as you move through the tunnels, the walls seeming to close in, reminding you that for many soldiers, this was both a sanctuary and a prison. You breathe deeply, letting the cool, damp air fill your lungs, grounding you, in this moment suspended between history and memory. You step out from the shadowy confines of the trenches, and into a battlefield forever changed by the roar of new machines, tanks, lumbering iron beasts that crushed barbed wire, and shattered the illusion of static war. You feel the ground tremble faintly beneath your feet, a distant growl echoing across the scarred landscape. These armored giants marked the beginning of mechanized warfare, an uneasy answer to the stalemate that had gripped both sides for years. Here's a scientific fact to steady your thoughts. The first tanks were powered by internal combustion engines, similar to early automobiles, converting fuel into mechanical motion, a remarkable leap in engineering that forever altered battlefield dynamics. These early models were slow and clunky, often prone to mechanical failure, but their psychological impact was profound. Imagine the surprise of infantry soldiers seeing these metallic beasts emerge through the smoke and mud. Now for a quirky tidbit. Some tank crews adopted the habit of naming their machines with grandiose titles like Mother or Fury, even decorating them with playful symbols or cartoons to lighten the grim atmosphere. It was as if these steel behemoths had personalities, and the crews clung to that humanizing touch amidst the chaos. Scientists still argue whether this kind of personification helped maintain morale, or was just an ironic distraction. The tanks were imperfect weapons, frequently stuck in trenches or immobilized by rough terrain, but they hinted at the future of warfare: speed, protection, and firepower combined. You can almost smell the oily smoke and hear the clanking tracks as the tanks roared into no man's land, terrifying friend and foe alike. Walking alongside the broken wreckage of one such tank, you notice the intricate tangle of gears and pistons exposed beneath the armored plates, a reminder of the delicate engineering beneath the brute force. The interior must have been a claustrophobic furnace, filled with the heat, noise, and fumes that tested the endurance of even the toughest crews. You catch yourself imagining the faces inside, soldiers squeezed into the tiny compartments, clutching controls with shaking hands, surrounded by the roar and rattle. And yet, they were pioneers on the front lines of a mechanized revolution, driving these monstrous machines into the heart of danger. A light chuckle escapes you as you picture a tank stuck in mud, its crew frantically pushing and swearing, while nearby soldiers watch, offering unsolicited advice. Even in war, some things remain timelessly human. The battlefield's eerie silence briefly returns as you move on, but you carry with you the memory of those early tanks, symbols of hope, terror, and the relentless march of technology that reshaped how wars were fought. You find yourself drifting toward the eerie quiet of a no-man's land at dusk, the air tinged with the faint scent of scorched earth and fading gunpowder. Here, the battlefield is a surreal landscape, shell craters filled with murky water, shattered trees standing like skeletal sentinels, and tangled barbed wire sprawled like a metallic jungle. The sun sinks low, casting long shadows that stretch over the desolation, as if the land itself is exhaling after a violent scream. Scientific fact: the muddy craters you see are formed by artillery shells that explode with terrifying force, displacing tons of earth in an instant. The impact creates unstable ground and lethal pockets of shrapnel, making no man's land a deadly maze. Interestingly, the soil's acidity from decayed shells even affected the local vegetation for decades after the war. For a quirky tidbit, some soldiers reported seeing phantom lights or mysterious glows at night, often attributed to bioluminescent fungi, or even the infamous will-o'-the-wisp phenomenon, ghostly lights that dance just beyond reach. Scientists still argue whether these sightings were purely natural or fueled by stress and fatigue in the war's surreal environment. As you wander the shattered terrain, the silence is punctuated only by the distant drip of water and the occasional rustle of a lonely crow. The broken wire and debris crunch underfoot as you imagine the countless patrols and night raids that crossed this forsaken stretch, each step a gamble with death. The weight of unseen danger hangs thick here, a constant, invisible presence. You recall tales of soldiers using rat traps, crude devices made from shell casings and wire to protect themselves from the ever-present vermin that thrived in these wastelands. Rats were so numerous they became almost mythic foes, stealing food, gnawing on wounds, and even nibbling on the fallen. A touch of dark humor sneaks in. No Man's Land was less a battlefield, and more a rat-themed escape room with barbed wire puzzles. Good luck if you ever got stuck in that game. The fading light pulls you toward the horizon, where the silhouettes of ruined villages and distant artillery flashes flicker faintly. This desolation is a graveyard for dreams and a canvas for resilience, where every scar tells a story of survival against impossible odds. You breathe deeply, tasting the cold, damp air, and let your mind rest amid the stillness of a world forever changed by the thunderous echoes of war. As the quiet of the battlefield settles around you, you feel the weight of history gently easing off your shoulders. The mud, the wire, the echoes of distant artillery, they all begin to fade like whispers on the wind. You're no longer standing amid the chaos, but drifting softly above it, carried on a slow, calming breeze. Let your thoughts unwind like the slow unfolding of dawn, the colors softening, the sharp edges smoothing out. Imagine the gentle rustle of leaves in a peaceful forest, the distant song of a bird waking up to a new day. The harsh clangs and shouts retreat into a quiet hum, like the comforting buzz of a fan, steady and soothing. Remember, this journey through the shadowed trenches and broken fields was never about reliving pain. It was about understanding resilience, the fragile hope that flickers even in the darkest nights. The world moved on, and so will you, carried by the steady rhythm of your own breath, as calm and persistent as the tides. Now, close your eyes and feel the gentle embrace of rest, like a soft blanket wrapping around you, pulling you into a serene slumber. The stories you've heard tonight will settle into your dreams, mingling with the quiet peace you deserve. Thank you for walking this path with me. May your sleep be deep and your dreams be kind. When you wake, may you carry a bit of that quiet strength with you. End of script. Sweet dreams. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop your location and local time below. It's always wild to see who's joining us from where. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge through mud that clings to your boots like a second skin, the trench walls pressing in, a narrow corridor of decay and whispers. This was the daily reality for millions during World War I, where the battlefield stretched into endless zigzags of trenches, pocked with craters and barbed wire, where moments of terror intertwined with stretches of crushing monotony. Life in the trenches wasn't just about dodging bullets or shell fire. It was about enduring the claustrophobic, damp conditions that gnawed at your sanity. Rats the size of your hand scurried across soggy floors, feasting on discarded rations and worse. The air was thick with the stench of decay, sweat, and unwashed bodies. You'd learn quickly that the enemy wasn't just the opposing army. It was the mud, the lice, and the cold that seeped into your bones. Scientifically speaking, your body would enter a kind of survival mode in this environment. Prolonged exposure to cold and damp triggers your body to constrict blood vessels to preserve core temperature, often leading to trench foot, a nasty, painful condition where your feet swell and rot if left wet for too long. Doctors still debate whether trench foot was aggravated more by bacterial infection or constant moisture, but either way, it was a war within the war. During the lulls in fighting, boredom became its own kind of torment. Soldiers carved boredom relief routines, card games, makeshift concerts, or telling tall tales about the one that got away. Some even reported hallucinations after weeks of trench duty. Probably not the best time to question your sanity. Yet, the camaraderie forged in these moments was intense. The shared misery made brothers out of strangers. A quirky tidbit: some soldiers kept trench journals, underground magazines, written and illustrated by troops themselves, full of dark humor, cartoons, and poems mocking the officers or the war itself. These publications were morale boosters, proof that humor survived even in mud and blood. Scientists still argue whether the mental strain from trench warfare directly influenced the modern understanding of PTSD, then called shell shock. What's clear is the trenches became an incubator for early psychological studies, transforming how we see trauma today. So, next time you feel stuck in a boring meeting, imagine this muddy trench, where every second might mean life or death. But mostly it meant waiting for orders, for relief, or just for the sun to rise through the fog of war. You step out of the trench for a moment, boots squelching in the mud as you survey the no-man's land, a blasted wasteland stretching between you and the enemy. The ground looks like it was churned by a giant's restless dreams, shell craters filled with murky water, broken trees stripped of leaves, and tangled barbed wire snaking in every direction. The silence is eerie, broken only by distant artillery thunder like a growling beast far away, promising chaos that could erupt at any moment. Walking this deadly space was like navigating a surreal nightmare. Soldiers had to creep across this open ground, often under fire, hoping the mud wouldn't swallow them whole. The term, no man's land, itself tells you everything. This was territory owned by no one, a gray zone where death could lurk behind any shattered stump or twisted wire. Your senses sharpen as you dodge sharp metal and hidden pitfalls. The air is thick with the scent of cordite from spent shells, and the faint metallic tang of blood. At night, the landscape transforms into a ghostly terrain, under a veil of fog or moonlight, where shadows play tricks and every sound could mean an enemy creeping closer. Interestingly, the physics of artillery shells in this environment reveal something about the science of explosion and shockwaves. When a shell detonates, it sends a supersonic shockwave through the air and ground, causing devastating damage. These shockwaves create secondary effects, like the infamous shell shock. Due to the intense pressure changes impacting the human body, scientists still argue whether the mental trauma was caused more by the physical shockwave or the horrifying experiences themselves. A quirky historical note: some soldiers believe that the craters filled with water could heal wounds if dipped in. Probably wishful thinking, but it reflects how desperation breeds strange rituals. Others took to decorating no man's land with tiny crosses or makeshift memorials, a silent rebellion against the chaos. Boredom in the trenches was one thing, but the terror of no man's land was a different beast. Raids into this space were often quick, chaotic affairs, sometimes no more than a few minutes of running and firing before retreating to the muddy safety of the trench. Yet, these brief moments could define lives. So, as you stand there, feeling the cold bite of the wind and the sticky mud underfoot, you realize how this barren zone symbolized the brutal stalemate of the war itself, caught between advance and retreat, hope and despair. You trudge back into the trench, the wooden planks beneath your boots slick with mud and grime. The smell here is a thick mix of damp earth, sweat, and something far less describable, the stench of decay and unwashed bodies that clings to everything around you. Soldiers sit or lie in small groups, some whispering quietly, others just staring into the distance, eyes glazed like fish caught in a net. The trench is a world unto itself, a labyrinthine wound carved into the earth, alive with the murmurs of waiting and the weight of unseen fear. This cramped, grim space is the front line of modern industrial warfare, where millions would live in muddy tunnels just inches from death. The design of trenches was both practical and a grim necessity, deep enough to protect from bullets and shrapnel but claustrophobic enough to crush spirits. You feel the rough wood of the duckboards beneath your feet, meant to keep soldiers from sinking deeper into the mud, though often failing against the relentless wet. Inside, you hear the constant drip of water seeping through the walls, the rattling of sandbags, and the faint scratching of rats that have made the trenches their domain. These rats weren't just pests, they became legendary enemies, growing fat on the remains of fallen soldiers, and sometimes even nibbling on the living. You shudder, recalling how one soldier joked that the rats were the only things thriving in this hellscape. Scientifically, the trench environment was a breeding ground for diseases, trench foot, caused by prolonged exposure to wet and sanitary conditions, led to swelling and even gangrene. Medical science was still catching up, and while treatments improved as the war dragged on, many soldiers suffered horrible fates simply from the environment. Scientists still argue whether trench foot or combat injuries caused more casualties during certain periods. On a lighter, though grimly humorous note, some soldiers fashioned trench art from bullet casings and shell fragments, turning instruments of death into delicate carvings or jewelry. It was a way to reclaim some small control, a quirky human defiance amid chaos. You notice the quiet conversations, the shared cigarettes passed around like treasure, the whispered prayers, and the letters from home read over and over. These small rituals punctuated the endless wait, grounding soldiers in their humanity. Yet, every distant boom reminded you that relief was only temporary. In this muddy corridor of war, you understand how the trenches became a symbol of endurance and despair, the muddy veins pumping lifeblood through a dying world. You climb out of the trench, the chill of the early morning mist settling on your skin like a thin, cold blanket. Above, the battlefield stretches before you, an expanse of churned earth scarred by craters, broken trees, and barbed wire tangled like metallic serpents. The sky is a dull gray, heavy with the threat of rain, but it's the silence that's most unnerving. It's the calm before the storm, the kind of quiet that presses in on you, making every breath feel loud, and every heartbeat a drum of impending dread. As you prepare to move forward, you notice the peculiar shapes of the artillery shells, some painted bright colors, others marked with cryptic symbols. These were the new weapons of industrialized death, capable of leveling entire forests or towns with a single barrage. You can almost hear the distant whistle of an incoming shell, a sound that soldiers would come to dread more than anything else. Scientific advances in artillery technology changed warfare forever. The sheer explosive power unleashed was a testament to industrial might, but also a horrifying testament to human ingenuity and destruction. Interestingly, some of the chemicals used in shells later found peaceful applications, like dyes and medicines. Scientists still argue whether the rapid development of these weapons was an inevitable consequence of industrialization or a preventable spiral fueled by nationalism. You step carefully, boots sinking slightly into the mud, aware of the invisible dangers beneath your feet, landmines, unexploded shells, and the ever-present threat of sniper fire. It's a deadly puzzle, this no man's land, where every step could be your last. Soldiers tried to map it out, but the landscape shifted with each barrage, making navigation a perilous guessing game. There's a strange irony in how nature fought back too. Wildflowers started to bloom in the shell craters, and in some spots, birds seemed oblivious to the destruction below. One quirky observation soldiers made was that glowing fungi sometimes appeared on fallen wood, eerie blue lights in the night, which some whispered were signs of the battlefield's haunted soul. You hear whispered rumors about secret weapons and new tactics, flamethrowers, poison gas, tanks slowly rumbling into view. These innovations were both terrifying and revolutionary. You recall how some troops joked that the war would soon be fought by robots, though that seemed like science fiction back then. As you survey the landscape, you feel the heavy weight of history pressing down. This battlefield is not just mud and wire. It's a crucible where the future of warfare was forged in fire and fear. The sound of distant gunfire hums like a low thunderstorm rolling over the scarred landscape. You trudge forward, every step weighed down by the thick, clinging mud that threatens to suck your boots off if you're not careful. The air is sharp with the scent of damp earth and burning wood, mixed with the metallic tang of spilled blood, though your mind tries to dull that last part, as sleep won't come easy if you dwell too much on it. Around you, the silhouettes of your comrades move like ghosts in the fog, faces smeared with grime, eyes hollow but determined. One of the strangest sights you encounter are the trench rats, enormous, fearless creatures who feast on the detritus of war, sometimes even the fallen. These rats seemed almost to mock the soldiers, surviving the chaos with unnerving success. In fact, during the war, soldiers reported that rats grew so large, some joked they could be ridden like horses, which probably says a lot about their sleep-deprived imagination. Scientists still argue whether these rat populations exploded solely because of the war conditions, or if other ecological factors played a part. Your mind drifts to the new sounds of the war, the clanking of machine guns firing their relentless stream, the sudden, sharp crack of rifles, and the eerie whistles of bombs flying overhead. The machine gun was a terrifying invention, a mechanical beast that could mow down waves of soldiers before they even got close. It was so effective that entire military tactics had to be reconsidered. Ironically, the same principle of rapid firing had been inspired by earlier attempts at mass-producing tools, showing how industrial progress always walks a fine line between creation and destruction. As you navigate the narrow trench corridors, the walls lined with sandbags and splintered wood, you notice the crude carvings etched by soldiers into the beams, names, dates, little drawings of loved ones, or crude jokes to keep spirits up. These tiny acts of humanity, amid the horror, remind you that this war is more than just strategy and technology. It's millions of individual stories tangled in barbed wire. Amid the constant threat, soldiers found solace in small routines, trading letters, sharing rations, or even daring to tell a joke. You hear about the famed trench humor, where gallows humor became a survival mechanism. One favorite was the nickname, plum puddings, for enemy shells, since they left behind chunks of earth that looked like burnt desserts, a morbid but oddly comforting joke. The war also brought forward fascinating psychological questions. Scientists still argue whether prolonged exposure to the horrors of trench warfare caused permanent brain changes, or if many symptoms were psychosomatic. The term, shell shock, was coined to describe these effects, an early recognition of what we now understand as PTSD. You pause, imagining the muddy trenches, stretched out beneath the gray sky, a maze of fear, endurance, and fleeting hope. You step out of the trench briefly, the cold air biting your cheeks as you climb over the parapet into no man's land. A desolate expanse of churned-up mud, broken barbed wire, and shattered trees standing like skeletal sentinels. The landscape feels strangely quiet, almost surreal, as if the earth itself is holding its breath. The ground is littered with the debris of battle, spent shells, discarded rifles, and the eerie remnants of uniforms, sometimes caught on wire like forgotten flags. Here, in this blasted zone, the war's relentless machinery is on full display. The creeping, calculated destruction of artillery barrages is as much a psychological weapon as a physical one. You hear that scientists have measured how repeated concussive blasts could alter brain function, a grim reminder of how technology was shaping not just bodies, but minds. While the trenches were grim, no man's land was an even crueler no man's place, an expanse that swallowed soldiers whole, where survival often hinged on the briefest moments of courage or sheer luck. The mud here could be a grave. Soldiers sometimes joked it was the worst graveyard ever, and it's not hard to see why. It clings, it pulls, and if you fell, you risked being trapped like a creature caught in a spider's web. Amid this bleakness, there's an odd phenomenon called trench art. Soldiers fashioned objects from shell casings, buttons, and bones. It's a curious human impulse to create beauty and meaning from destruction. One soldier carved an entire chess set from wood scavenged on the battlefield, an island of strategy and distraction amid chaos. And while the war was dominated by the massive industrial powers, scientists still argue about the effectiveness of the creeping barrage tactic, where artillery fire moved just ahead of advancing infantry. Did it truly protect soldiers, or did it sometimes cause more confusion and casualties? The debates rage on, much like the battles themselves. You imagine the terrifying advance across no man's land during an offensive, soldiers bursting from trenches, running under a hailstorm of bullets, barbed wire snagging clothes and flesh alike. It's a dance with death choreographed by strategy and desperation. The sky above sometimes glows with flares and tracer bullets, painting the night with eerie light. This shattered earth is more than just a battlefield. It's a silent witness to courage, fear, and the strange, stubborn resilience of those caught in the machine of war. The cold seeps into your bones as you linger at the edge of the shattered no man's land, watching the distant flashes of artillery light up the night sky like some grim fireworks display nobody asked for. It's hard to imagine, but beneath all this destruction, armies on both sides began to dig deeper, not just in trenches, but into tunnels and bunkers that stretched for miles beneath the earth. These subterranean networks were a whole new battlefield, a shadow war of claustrophobic passages and deadly encounters in near total darkness. You can almost hear the eerie silence down there, punctuated only by the occasional scrape of a shovel or the muffled whisper of soldiers trying to listen for enemy digging. The practice of tunneling under enemy lines, then detonating massive explosives to blow up their positions, was both ingenious and terrifying, a literal game of cat and mouse underground. Scientists still argue whether these underground strategies prolonged the war, or just added another layer of horror to an already hellish conflict. The tunnels could collapse without warning, and the air was thick with dust and the faint scent of explosives. Many soldiers suffered from casein disease, or decompression sickness, a little-known affliction caused by the rapid changes in air pressure while working underground. It's a strange and often overlooked piece of World War's medical puzzle, how the environment itself became an enemy. One quirky fact that often surprises people is that some soldiers use carrier pigeons to send messages between trenches and command posts. These birds were decorated like tiny war heroes, and their reliability was so highly valued that a pigeon named Sherami famously saved nearly 200 soldiers by delivering a critical message despite being wounded. It's a reminder that even in a mechanized war, nature found its role. As you imagine crawling through those dark, narrow tunnels, you realize that this invisible underworld was a perfect metaphor for the war itself. Hidden struggles beneath a surface already scarred and chaotic. The bravery required to venture into such darkness, not knowing if death or discovery awaited, is staggering. With every step, the war stretches deeper, not just across continents, but beneath the very ground you walk on. You find yourself back on the surface, trudging through muddy trenches now slick with rain, as the dawn breaks with a faint gray light seeping through low clouds. The world around you feels like a painting smeared by mud and smoke, the air thick with a mix of damp earth and something less tangible, fear, exhaustion, and a strange kind of resignation. The morning is supposed to bring a fresh start, but in this war, dawn often just means the next round of relentless shelling. Around you, the soldiers are quiet, their faces gaunt and eyes hollow but alert. The constant threat of a gas attack hangs like a shadow over everything. Mustard gas and chlorine, those cruel inventions of chemical warfare, have changed the rules completely. The chemical agents can burn skin, damage lungs, and blind victims, turning the battlefield into a toxic nightmare. Scientists have long debated the ethics and long-term effects of chemical weapons, with many agreeing this marked a chilling turning point in modern warfare. You notice soldiers fumbling with their gas masks, those awkward, bulky devices that have become an essential, if uncomfortable, part of their gear. The mask's strange rubbery smell mixes with the ever-present scent of damp wool and metal. It's odd to think that a simple mask could mean the difference between life and a painful, slow death, technology so basic yet so vital. On a lighter note, amidst this grim setting, soldiers sometimes carve tiny gas mask figurines from bits of scrap metal, odd keepsakes that oddly humanize the harshness. It's almost as if these tokens help them cope, a small rebellion against the impersonal machinery of war. Scientists still argue about how much gas actually influenced battle outcomes versus the psychological terror it induced. Did the fear of gas sometimes cause more strategic retreat than the actual physical damage? It's a question historians and chemists debate while the ghosts of those attacks linger in memories and stories. You inhale deeply, feeling the chill and the dampness cling to your skin, imagining what it must have been like to hold your breath, don that mask, and charge forward knowing the invisible enemy could strike at any moment. It's a cruel game of survival, in a world transformed by chemicals and fear. The roar of artillery fades into a distant thunder as you step closer to the sprawling, muddy mess of a battlefield littered with tangled barbed wire and the remnants of hastily abandoned trenches. It's here that you truly grasp the brutality of trench warfare, the endless back and forth, the grim stalemate that sucked the life out of so many young souls. You trudge through the wet earth, your boots squelching, the smell of decay and gunpowder thick in the air, a cocktail of death that lingers long after the guns fall silent. Trench warfare was less about glory and more about endurance. You squeeze into narrow, rat-infested ditches that offer little protection, but a whole lot of misery. Soldiers learn to live with the constant drip of water, the ever-present mud that seeped into everything, and the buzzing chorus of flies attracted to the unfortunate. Scientists still argue whether trench conditions themselves caused more casualties than the bullets and shells. The unsanitary environment bred diseases like trench foot, a nasty fungal infection that could lead to gangrene and amputation if untreated. One quirky fact is that some soldiers turn to trench art, crafting intricate sculptures and objects from spent shell casings and scraps of metal. These little pieces of creativity amid chaos offered a brief escape and a way to hold on to humanity when everything else seemed lost. You might chuckle thinking about the absurdity of these miniature works of art, existing in such a gruesome place. It's a strange blend of destruction and creation, a reminder that even in the darkest times, the human spirit can find a flicker of light. Imagine, too, the psychological toll, the shell shock. What we now recognize as PTSD began to emerge as soldiers faced unending stress and trauma. Scientists still debate how much this invisible wound shaped the future understanding of mental health in combat. As you stand there, surrounded by the echoes of battles long gone, you can almost feel the weight of the countless stories buried beneath your feet. Stories of fear, hope, loss, and a stubborn will to survive. You find yourself shifting away from the trenches, stepping into the eerie silence of the no-man's land that stretches between opposing forces like a scar on the earth. This barren expanse is a wasteland of shattered trees, craters filled with stagnant water, and the occasional remnants of a soldier's kit half buried in the mud. It's a place where nature and war collide in an unsettling way. Shell holes have become tiny ponds where frogs croak, and wildflowers stubbornly bloom amidst the ruins, defying the devastation. As you carefully navigate this ghostly terrain, your senses heighten. The smell of damp earth mixed with the metallic tang of leftover explosives lingers. You notice the tiny glint of a spent bullet embedded in a tree stump, and the faint echo of distant artillery. This is no man's land, a name as ominous as its reality, deadly, desolate, and terrifyingly quiet between bouts of violence. Scientists still argue whether no man's land was more psychologically damaging than the trenches. The constant threat of snipers, mines, and sudden attacks kept soldiers on edge, turning this stretch into a deadly limbo, where stepping the wrong way meant instant death. You might picture the soldiers' mix of dread and numbness as they crossed this land, a perilous journey of inches that could change the course of a battle or end it altogether. Here's a quirky tidbit for you. During quieter moments, some soldiers would carve messages or doodles into the trees and rocks of no man's land, a kind of eerie graffiti left for whoever might come after. It's a strange way to claim a tiny piece of a place that belongs to no one yet controls everything. Remember, the no man's land wasn't just a physical barrier, but a symbol of the war's futility. Two sides locked in a deadly standstill, neither gaining ground, both losing hope. Your feet sink slightly in the mud as you consider the silence here, a silence that's almost louder than any gunfire, echoing with the ghosts of those who crossed this ground long ago. You move forward, leaving no man's land behind, stepping into the chaos of the artillery barrage that defines much of this war. The ground shakes beneath your feet as shells explode in rhythmic thuds, sending up clouds of smoke and dirt. The sound is deafening, a brutal, mechanical roar that never quite lets up. You can almost taste the dust in the air, gritty and heavy, clinging to your tongue as if war itself is inhaled with every breath. Artillery was the king of the battlefield, capable of leveling entire villages and reshaping landscapes. Imagine the logistics: miles of trenches, endless supplies of shells, and men racing to reload massive guns under constant threat. Scientists still argue whether artillery was the single most decisive factor in World War's staggering casualties, but there's no doubt it defined the war's character. Here's a quirky fact: some shells were even filled with chemicals, like tear gas or chlorine, marking one of the first times chemical warfare entered the modern arsenal. Soldiers had to scramble for makeshift gas masks, often little more than soaked cloths pressed against their faces. The mental toll was immense, as you imagine the slow, creeping fear of invisible enemies. The landscape itself transformed under artillery fire. A once familiar countryside turned into a moonscape of craters and twisted metal. This constant bombardment wore down not only the land, but the spirits of the men who endured it, blending exhaustion with the surrealness of living amidst such destruction. You trudge through this pulverized earth, the weight of history pressing down as you try to imagine what it felt like to be there. Heart pounding, ears ringing, every moment a fight to survive against a mechanical force that seemed both endless and indifferent. You stumble onward, now deep inside the tangled web of trench warfare, an endless maze of mud, wood, and wire. The smell is a thick mix of damp earth, sweat, and something darker, almost unplaceable but unmistakably present: the stench of decay and desperation. It clings to your clothes and skin like a second layer, impossible to shake off. Trenches were the defining feature of World War I, stretching for hundreds of miles across the Western Front. They offered protection, yes, but also became prisons. Imagine the claustrophobia, narrow, cramped spaces, where you sleep inches from comrades, the constant drip of water, the cold that seeps into your bones. Scientists still argue whether the psychological damage of trench life contributed more to casualties than the bullets and shells themselves. One quirky tidbit: soldiers used to fashion trench art from spent shell casings and scrap metal, turning instruments of war into delicate carvings and jewelry. A small attempt at normalcy, or maybe just a way to pass the endless hours of waiting. Communication in trenches was a nightmare. Runners, pigeons, and primitive telephones carried messages, but the fog of war often garbled orders, leading to confusion and tragic mistakes. The wire entanglements out front served as both a defense and a deadly trap for anyone foolish enough to cross. You imagine yourself lying low in the mud, the distant whistle of incoming shells making your pulse race. Every step outside the trench is a calculated risk, each patrol a brush with death. Yet amidst the horror, moments of camaraderie and humor flicker, soldiers swapping stories, sharing rations, laughing at the absurdity of it all. And just when you think the trenches couldn't get any worse, there's always the weather, rain turning trenches into quagmires, winter biting through the thin uniforms, summer bringing swarms of lice and rats as big as cats. The war didn't just attack the body, it broke the spirit, bit by bit. You trudge forward, now following the muddy trails to the front lines, where artillery roars like thunder, shaking the very ground beneath your feet. The sheer scale of bombardment during World War I was unlike anything before it. Guns that could fire shells weighing hundreds of pounds, exploding with enough force to level entire villages, became the grim symphony of this conflict. Scientists still argue whether the sheer intensity of artillery caused more psychological trauma than the actual combat itself. Picture the sky filled with thick smoke, orange flashes, and the whistle of shells zooming past your ears. The earth trembles with every blast, sending clouds of dirt and debris into the air, mingling with the acrid smell of gunpowder. You probably won't survive this without feeling your heart hammering against your ribs like a trapped bird. One quirky tidbit that might surprise you: soldiers sometimes decorated their helmets with personal charms, or painted them in bizarre designs to mock the seriousness around them, like tiny rebellious art pieces amid destruction. It was a silent way to hold on to individuality, when everything else seemed designed to strip it away. Communication and coordination amid this chaos were incredibly challenging. The introduction of new technologies, like the creeping barrage, where artillery fire moved forward in timed waves just ahead of advancing infantry, required precise timing and nerves of steel. But even then, friendly fire and miscommunication were tragically common. The psychological strain was immense, leading to what was then called shell shock, a term that barely scratched the surface of the trauma soldiers endured. Scientists still debate the full causes and best treatments, but what's clear is that war was not just fought on fields but inside minds. Through all this, you notice a strange contrast: the terrifying noise outside and the eerie silence when the guns momentarily cease. In those brief moments, you can hear the faint sounds of nature, birds cautiously resuming their song, the rustle of leaves, and the distant cries of men. You press onward, sinking deeper into the labyrinth of trenches that scar the landscape like giant wounds. These narrow, muddy corridors are lined with wooden planks, barbed wire, and the occasional flicker of a candle struggling against the damp gloom. The trench system wasn't just a defensive measure, it was a world unto itself, with its own rhythms, dangers, and strange rituals. Scientific fact time: the water in these trenches often reached ankle deep, sometimes higher, creating a perfect breeding ground for trench foot, a painful condition caused by prolonged exposure to damp and sanitary conditions. Soldiers had to change their socks regularly, or risk their feet literally rotting away. Imagine that, a foot slowly giving up on life, all while you try to stay alert for the next barrage. And here's a quirky tidbit: to keep spirits up, some troops formed what could only be described as trench theater companies, putting on plays and comedy sketches with whatever scraps they had. Makeshift stages emerged between sandbags, and despite the omnipresent threat of death, laughter sometimes echoed through the mud. Scientists still argue whether the trench lifestyle was more punishing physically or psychologically. The constant noise, the stench of decay, and the endless waiting turned men into shadows of themselves. Rats, giant, brazen creatures that feasted on leftovers and the fallen, were an ever-present menace. Some soldiers joked they were the real victors of the war, growing fat on the spoils of human misery. Amid this, you learn to appreciate the small moments, a shared cigarette, a letter from home, the rare sight of sunlight breaking through heavy clouds. These glimpses of normalcy remind you that beneath the mud and fear, you're still human. As you trudge through this grim world, remember that the war wasn't just fought with guns and shells. It was a battle for endurance, willpower, and the hope that someday, this hellish landscape would give way to peace. You keep moving forward, sensing that the war's end is still a distant, hazy dream, as endless as the barbed wire stretching across the horizon. The soldiers' lives are punctuated by artillery blasts that shake the very earth beneath your feet, and the acrid smell of cordite fills the air. You notice how even the sky seems subdued, heavy with gray clouds that mirror the somber mood of the front. A fascinating scientific fact: the sheer magnitude of artillery fire during World War I was unprecedented, with over 1.5 million shells fired in some major battles. The concussive force could shatter eardrums, cause brain trauma, and churn the soil into a barren moonscape. This relentless bombardment reshaped not only the land, but the minds of those who endured it. Here's a quirky and somewhat bizarre tidbit. During lulls in fighting, some soldiers took up trench art, crafting intricate items like jewelry, cigarette cases, and figurines from shell casings and other scrap materials. These trinkets became cherished tokens, reminders of life beyond the trenches, and proof that creativity can bloom even in the darkest places. Scholars still debate the true psychological impact of trench warfare on soldiers, with some suggesting that the constant stress led to what we now call PTSD, while others argue that camaraderie and routine provided a surprising amount of mental resilience. Either way, the trench was a crucible where the human spirit was tested to its limits. You find yourself reflecting on how this war changed everything: the nature of combat, society's view of heroism, and the very fabric of nations. It was a brutal teacher, offering harsh lessons about technology, politics, and the cost of conflict. As you prepare to leave this muddy world behind, the images linger: the endless trenches, the flicker of hope amid despair, the resilience of those who fought. The war's echoes remain, reminding you of the fragile line between destruction and survival. You feel the heavy weight of silence settle over the battlefield as the guns finally fall quiet. The war that tore through so many lives, landscapes, and futures has drawn to a close, not with a triumphant cheer, but a weary sigh. The armistice, signed on that chilly November morning in 1918, marks the fragile hope for peace, a pause after years of relentless suffering. As the dawn breaks, you notice the battered soldiers emerging from their trenches, ice-glazed but searching for home, for family, for a life beyond the endless mud. The ground beneath them, once alive with the chaos of battle, now holds the stories of sacrifice and endurance etched deep into its soil. Science tells us that the trauma of this great war reshaped not only geopolitics but also our understanding of human psychology and resilience. The scars, visible and invisible, remind us that peace is not simply the absence of war, but the presence of healing. And here's a curious fact to ponder as you drift away. Some historians argue that the very innovations designed to end this war, tanks, airplanes, chemical weapons, set the stage for even greater conflicts. Scientists still debate whether the lessons learned were enough to prevent future devastation, or if history was doomed to repeat itself. So as you close your eyes tonight, imagine the quiet fields, where once stood armies, now blossoming with new life. Let the memories of those who endured this chapter gently fade into peaceful dreams. End of script. Sweet dreams.